This committee will come to order. Today, we're holding a hearing to discuss urgent federal funding needs for communities that are harmed by the recent natural disasters. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge briefly, this is the first hearing we've had since the election. It is clear some things will look different next year, but one thing will not change, and it is my commitment to working with Senator Collins to keep doing the important work of this committee in a bipartisan manner, despite any disruptions thrown our way. There is too much at stake for families back home for any of us to throw up our hands. We also still have to wrap up our FY25 bills, so I remain committed to working together to complete that process as quickly as possible in a manner consistent with the Senate's bipartisan bills, which we have all put so much effort into. So back to the subject at hand, we will have two panels of witnesses today. First, Senators Ossoff and Tillis will speak about the challenges their states are facing. Then we will hear from top federal officials at the Department of Transportation, the Small Business Administration, Department of Agriculture, Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We also recently received an updated emergency supplemental request from the White House, which offers a helpful roadmap, but it is just the start. We know it will take full time to fully assess the needs of our communities impacted by the hurricanes and other natural disasters and the resources required to recover. So I hope we can take what we hear today and act swiftly in a bipartisan way to provide relief. After all, there is a long history of members coming together quickly in the wake of tragedy. Every one of us knows our states have needed help after disasters before, and we will certainly need help again. When disaster strikes, it should never matter who's in the White House, who's in the majority, which governor is asking for support, or how anyone voted in an election or on a last bill. As I've said before, you don't argue over whether to put out a fire, you don't debate how much water or to use or how many people to save. You roll up your sleeves, you get to work, and you get help out the door as much as needed, as fast as possible. Right now, there are a lot of people in our country needing help, and yet this is one of the longest times in my memory that we've gone without Congress providing disaster funding. That's unacceptable. It is well past time we get aid out to the many people in need after the many disasters we have faced over the past 2 years. We've seen devastating wildfires, including in my home state of Washington, and the utter destruction in Maui. We've seen a typhoon hit Guam last year, which is still in recovery. We've seen historic flooding in Vermont and deadly tornadoes in several of our states. There's the ongoing effort to rebuild after the Key Bridge collapse in Baltimore. And of course, the two hurricanes that recently tore through the South with catastrophic effect. It is clear that Hurricane Milton and Hurricane Helene were devastating, but the full extent of the damage is still coming into focus. And while we can see the road to recovery more clearly, we can also see it is a long one and it will take serious federal support. There are still communities without power and clean drinking water. There are miles and miles of roads and bridges that are still washed away. Families are wondering how they'll be able to return home if their house is gone. Farmers are wondering how they can recover from the loss of crops and poultry and more. Business owners are wondering how they will ever reopen their doors, and more than that, how their entire city or community will rebuild, especially those communities that thrived on tourism. People are desperate for answers and help and hope, and they are looking to Congress for action. We cannot let them down. Not now, not ever. That's why it's so important we come together to pass a bipartisan supplemental that meets these challenges. We need to replenish FEMA's disaster relief fund. Right now, the backbone of our disaster response is running on fumes. We need more funding for the Department of Transportation's emergency relief program. In 2013, when Washington State had a bridge collapse, that program was critical to our recovery, and it is critical now for rebuilding and reopening the Key Bridge, not to mention the roads that were washed out by Helene. We also need funding for HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, which will help families get a roof back over their heads. Some communities have been waiting nearly 2 years to know whether any disaster HUD disaster funding is coming their way. The needs are piling up, and the longer we wait to rebuild housing, the more rents will stay high for everyone in those communities, whether you lost your home or not. We also need funding at the Department of Agriculture to support our farmers who lost a season's crop. And of course, we must replenish the Small Business Administration's disaster loan program. SBA loans make it possible for renters and homeowners and businesses to get started on things like rebuilding and reopening and mold remediation. President Biden and members on both sides of the aisle have worked tirelessly to get people the help they need. And this committee is going to do everything it can to make sure we fulfill our obligations to get money out the door and get support to our communities. But funds are exhausted, and the SBA backlog is growing, over 60,000 applications already. I really appreciate the work of Senator Tillis and Senator Warner to craft a bipartisan bill on this. It was incredibly frustrating to see their bill blocked by a senator last week. But we are not giving up. We need to get this done. We need to get it done soon. I want to underscore that. Delay is not harmless. It carries its own cost, one that families and communities will be forced to bear for years. Businesses shuttered, jobs lost, family farms bankrupt, houses overtaken by water damage and mold, communities unable to return and rebuild and reopen, families forced to abandon the houses and communities they love because they can't afford to stay, not to mention people forced by desperation and necessity to take out predatory and high-interest loans. Every day we don't act, the costs grow. And in one final point, in times of crisis, it is actively harmful when political leaders spread disinformation and mistruths about relief efforts. The blatant lies we saw repeated this past fall, particularly in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, do nothing to help. It undercuts trust in FEMA, and importantly, it discourages people from getting the help they are otherwise eligible for. I know and I trust that members of this committee, Republican and Democrat, are committed to getting accurate information out there to help as many as people as possible. So I urge everyone to listen closely to this discussion today and let the weight of the work ahead really sink in. I hope that after this discussion, we will be able to work together in a quick, bipartisan way to draft and pass a supplemental that truly meets the challenges our communities are facing. Thank you. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Chair Murray. I want to begin my remarks this morning by commending Chair Murray for her bipartisan leadership and hard work during the past 2 years. This hearing is a great example of her approach. It demonstrates her effective commitment to carefully reviewing budget requests, and it was scheduled very quickly so that we could meet the needs of our nation, and it really exemplifies the bipartisan leadership that she has demonstrated. And I look forward to continuing to work closely with her in the next 2 years. I want to thank our witnesses today, particularly Senators Tillis and Ossoff, for being with us. Senator Tillis and I have had, I've lost count of the number of conversations that we've had about his state's needs following the recent horrific flooding in Western North Carolina. And I look forward to both senators sharing their perspective with our committee. From the wildfires in the west, flooding in the northeast, drought throughout the plains, and hurricanes in the south, it seems that no region of the country has been spared from destruction caused by severe weather. Last winter, Maine's coast was hit with a pair of ferocious storms that wiped out portions of our state's iconic working waterfront. I toured storm-battered sites in Harpswell and Bailey Island last January and heard from many fishermen, lobstermen, and women that it was the worst storm damage that they had ever experienced. In fact, the state of Maine estimates that it took out about 50% of our fishing infrastructure in our state. When disaster strikes, the American people should have faith in federal efforts to help them. That goes for everyone, regardless of political beliefs. Like many of my colleagues, I was anchored by recent reports that a FEMA supervisor had directed relief workers to avoid Florida hurricane victims' homes that displayed Trump signs. This outrageous act stands in stark contrast to the very purpose of disaster relief and the trust that we have placed in the agency. There needs to be an Inspector General investigation to help ensure that all those responsible for playing politics with vulnerable people's lives and homes are held accountable. We must make sure that this discrimination and indifference to suffering can never happen again. Turning now to the nearly $100 billion request we received earlier this week, unsurprisingly, the largest request is for FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund. This fund provides the necessary resources to assist communities, individuals, and families affected by disasters all across our nation. Every state in the nation has had a disaster declared in recent years and has relied on FEMA for response and recovery, including several Maine communities affected by last year's winter storms. The Disaster Relief Fund, as the chair noted, is rapidly nearing exhaustion, with less than $5 billion in the fund today. The current balance is partly due to the catastrophic impact of Hurricanes Helene and Milton, which have already cost more than $7 billion in immediate response funding, even before recovery work has begun in earnest. We must replenish the fund so that FEMA can continue to respond to disasters affecting any of our states. While FEMA takes the lead for immediate disaster response, the Small Business Administration and the Departments of Transportation and Housing and Urban Development work to rebuild critical infrastructure, assist small businesses, and help communities address long-term recovery challenges. Today, we will also discuss the multiple disasters facing our farmers and rural communities. In addition to battling severe weather events, many farmers are facing an economic crisis. Net farm income has dropped, many commodity prices have significantly decreased, and there has been a major increase in input and operational costs due to inflation. I've heard from farmers in Maine who are struggling to stay afloat. They are doing all that they can to stay in operation, but many are being forced to cease operating. Maine alone has seen more than 600 farms shut down in the past decade. Once we lose these farms, most often they are gone forever. We must ensure that our farmers and rural communities have the resources needed to produce and protect our nation's food supply. While this hearing is focused on the need for disaster response funding, I would be remiss if I did not point out that one of the best ways we can help our states and communities is to pass the full year appropriations bills. This year, our committee came together and passed 11 of the 12 appropriations bills with strong bipartisan support. In fact, 6 of the bills were reported unanimously. These bills include the base funding needed to help communities address critical development and infrastructure needs, support our farmers, and protect our nation. Unfortunately, our committee-reported bills have languished on the Senate's calendar because of the majority leader's decisions. I hope that we can reverse this approach in the next few weeks, and we'll work with members on both sides of the aisle to try to make that happen. In the next Congress, we must redouble our efforts to restore regular order, to promote transparency, get bills enacted prior to the start of the fiscal year, and give all members a voice in the enactment of appropriations bills. I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Collins. I will now introduce our first panel of witnesses and move to testimony. Today, we're going to be hearing from our colleagues, Senator John Ossoff from the great state of Georgia, Senator Thom Tillis from the great state of North Carolina. Both of their states are reeling from the recent hurricanes, and we really appreciate both of you coming to share what you've seen and heard on the ground about the challenges and the needs that our families are facing. So we will begin with your testimony, and Senator Ossoff will begin with you first.
Well, Chair Murray, Vice Chair Collins, thank you for this opportunity to brief the committee on the dire conditions faced by Georgia farmers in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. Georgia farmers and farmers in neighboring states are suffering deeply, and Congress must proceed urgently to pass disaster relief by the end of the year. Georgia agriculture was devastated by this hurricane, and I respectfully urge this committee to swiftly send the full Senate a disaster relief bill that includes vital assistance for Georgia farmers who are in acute distress and who are the backbone of Georgia's rural communities and our state's economy. Hurricane-force winds and torrential rains destroyed fall crops still in the field, knocked down pecan orchards that growers spent decades cultivating, and damaged 1.5 million acres of timberland. 1.5 million acres of timberland. In addition to the agricultural devastation, Georgia suffered severe damage to the power grid, to businesses, housing, roads, and other critical infrastructure. Virtually every crop and commodity produced in Georgia has been seriously damaged, including poultry, cotton, timber, beef cattle, blueberries, pecans, peanuts, tobacco, vegetables, citrus, soybeans, nursery crops, and dairy. The Georgia Pecan Growers Association reports that 48,000 acres of pecan orchards were damaged, with a loss of nearly 400,000 trees. Pecan growers like Scott Hudson, a fifth-generation family farmer whose family also runs a cleaning and processing plant, faces 60 to 70% crop loss and 20 to 30% tree loss for their older trees, which will take 10 to 20 years to replace. Taylor and Aaron Moses in Uvalde estimate that they've lost 85% of their 800 acres of trees. They won't be able to save a single tree from the first orchard they planted in 2007. The Georgia Poultry Federation reports that 495 poultry houses took significant damage, including 295 that were completely lost. Van Wooten, a county commissioner in Jeff Davis County who's raised chickens for 31 years, saw all 10 of his chicken houses destroyed, many with birds still inside. Without our help, he isn't sure now whether he'll be able to return to raising chickens. The University of Georgia estimates that Georgia vegetable producers lost 25 to 30% of the fall crop. T.J. Moore's grandfather started farming in 1964. Now he, his brother, and their parents grow green beans, eggplant, bell peppers, cucumbers, and more. And due to the storm, they expect this fall to sell less than 30% of their normal crop. In Clinch County, blueberries make up 35% of the loan portfolio at the local bank. And in some of State Senator Russ Goodman's fields, a full quarter of the plants are broken off and blown over, which will also hurt next year's crop. I emphasize again, 1.5 million acres of Georgia timberland have been damaged, and we're projected to have lost 500 to 600,000 bales of cotton, or nearly 1/3 of our cotton crop. Colleagues, the numbers are staggering, but this isn't about numbers. It's about families and rural communities. And without our help, the simple fact is that many of these family farms will fold, and they may fold soon. They're staring at devastated farmland and orchards. They're deep in the red, and they're under immense stress. If they go under, our rural communities go under. The local tax base funding schools and infrastructure is destroyed, and the rural way of life in Georgia risks disappearing altogether. We know what we need to do, and the fact that my colleague Senator Tillis and I are here before you, a Democrat and a Republican, urging speed to achieve this essential goal, I hope is testimony to the urgency of bipartisan action before the end of the year. We must refuse the temptation to delay or to get dragged into politics. We must swiftly pass disaster assistance by the end of the year. My constituents and Americans in every state hit by this terrible storm and hit by natural disasters for the last several years are counting on all of us. And that's why I'm so grateful again, Chair Murray and Vice Chair Collins and members of the committee for the privilege of appearing before you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Ossoff. Senator Tillis.
Chair Murray, Vice Chair Collins, friends and colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, I got up this morning to review the prepared statement by my staff. I'm convinced I couldn't get through it without shedding a tear, so I'm going to have it submitted for the record. $102 lives lost. 151 homes destroyed, 500,000 businesses affected in disaster-declared areas, 5,000 miles of road. This is North Carolina statistics, ladies and gentlemen. 5,000 miles of road, including almost 5 miles of I-40 damaged and impassable for likely a couple of years. 1,300 public bridges and culverts damaged. 163 water and sewer systems damaged. 20,000 farms, disaster-declared counties with $3.4 billion in damage. This is a storm unlike any we've ever seen in our nation's history in the inland. 250 miles inland with nearly Category 1 hurricane force. After several days of drenching rain just a few days before. We have a disaster-declared area. If you eliminate some that were technically declared disasters, if you only count the landmass that has devastation like you've seen in Asheville or Boone or Burnsville or Big Creek or Canton or Clyde, I have thousands of people in harm's way. So I went to the floor last week just to try and fix one problem. But let me back up as I see Senator Schatz here. Back in August, Senator Schatz, I believe it was August, Senator Schatz, came to me and said, Tom, I hope you'll support me on the supplemental for Maui. I said, count me in, Brian, because I have no doubt that before the end of this season, I'll probably have to come to you and ask your support, and I'm expecting you'll be there, as he always is, as most of you already are. Actually, as 99 of you were last week to get the Small Business Administration plus up of $800 million. I had one objection. Now, folks, I don't think that my folks in North Carolina, Georgia, where both of my children were raised, and a sister who had a house damaged by the storm, or Florida, where I was born, they don't need tears, they need action. And we not only need action in the way that we normally respond to storms, we need an action in a very different way. I'm not talking about, I was born in Florida, raised in New Orleans, lived in virtually every southern state. I've seen storms in my life. I saw Camille hit Mississippi on my way to move to New Orleans. I've seen these storms. And interestingly enough, the topology of the coastal plains, you pretty much know what you need to get fixed pretty soon. And within 2 years, you can probably get most of the infrastructure done, people recovering their lives for decades, if ever. But that's not what we have in North Carolina. We have several river basins that flooded entire towns. Asheville just got drinkable water 2 days ago. The storm hit 54 days ago. And there are some communities that won't have it. I've got a community near the Virginia line that may be without power until March. The media has moved on, but the damage, it is impossible to conceive, even with what I'm saying today, without being there. And I would invite any of you to come here or come there and see it. So I'm going to submit my formal testimony for the record, Chair and Vice Chair, but we've got to do something differently. Let me give you an example of what people in Florida, my home state, are doing right now. They're being told by FEMA that Milton, they got parts of Florida got hit by Milton, parts of Florida got hit by Helene, parts of Florida got hit by Debbie. Can you imagine a municipal official right now who's being told, you got to distinguish between that utility pole that was debris with Debbie and debris with Milton or debris with Helene? Now, the good news is they're not having to distinguish between telephone poles that happened between Milton and Helene, but because Debbie was a little bit outside of the window, you got to distinguish that trash if you want to get reimbursed. Is that really what we're going to tell the states and local governments? That's how we do disaster recovery? Am I really going to say that I have to get all of my needs in 6 months to be able to have FEMA recovery? There are communities we won't get to in 6 months. So I thank you all for taking on the appropriations task. I intend to put another unanimous consent request together and maybe have another discussion with the junior senator from Kentucky, but I'm going to fight for the people who were affected, not only in North Carolina, but many states that I have family, friends, and have lived in. We've got to act. We've got to look at paycheck protection program. We've got to take a look at employee tax credits programs at work. We should be instructed by COVID to recognize this is a long-term recovery unlike we've ever seen. And we can either learn from it and start talking about creative ways now, or we can regret it later when some of my western cities are going to dry up. That policy is separate from your appropriations task. I thank you for the work that you're doing. I fully support the OMB request for $100 billion. But that's only the beginning. We've got to react differently to storms. This may be the first, but it won't be the last like we've seen in North Carolina, and we owe it to the American people to be ready to do better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Tillis. Thank you to both of you for being here today. We will now have our second panel of witnesses come forward and move to their testimony. And while they're coming forward, let me introduce them. We are joined today by Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, Small Business Administrator, Isabel Guzman, Deputy Secretary of Agriculture, Xochitl Torres Small, Deputy Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Adrianne Todman, and FEMA Administrator, Deanne Criswell. These agencies that are before us today are on the front line of our nation's disaster response efforts. We are very grateful for all of you for joining to share your perspective on the work and needs ahead. We will begin with testimony from each of you and then move to our senators for questions. Secretary Buttigieg, if you are ready, we will begin with you.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Chair Murray. Thank you, Vice Chair Collins, and thanks to all of the members of this committee for the opportunity to speak with you today alongside my colleagues from the Biden-Harris administration. A month ago, I was in North Carolina and Tennessee visiting some of the communities impacted by Hurricane Helene. I saw entire lanes of I-40 demolished and collapsed into the gorge below, washed out by heavy rainfall, likely exacerbated by climate change. I spoke to families, to small business owners, and community leaders about how this catastrophic storm impacted their lives and livelihoods, and about what they need in the short term and for the long haul. And I met with first responders who have been working tirelessly to help the people in these communities as they contend with the loss of homes, the loss of businesses, and the loss of life. In the weeks since, the Biden-Harris administration has continued to direct extensive, well-coordinated support to the communities devastated by these storms. We're working alongside state and local governments, nonprofit groups, and volunteer organizations in the ongoing response and recovery efforts. We've been working to combat an increasingly common and unequivocally harmful part of 21st century life, the rapid spread of falsehoods that we've come to call misinformation and disinformation across digital media, which in this case included the work of the Federal Aviation Administration, which acts to facilitate response and recovery while keeping our airspace safe. As of today, the U.S. Department of Transportation, through our Federal Highway Administration Emergency Relief, or ER, program, has delivered $187 million in funding to communities in North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia, as well as the federal land management agencies in these states to support immediate needs. These funds are being put to immediate use to get roads and bridges repaired and reopened and deal with disruptions in the meantime. Already we've seen how these funds are facilitating recovery, helping open US 276 near Caesars Head in Greenville County, South Carolina, and continuing the ongoing work along I-26 and I-40 between North Carolina and Tennessee to restore access to those critical roadways. As valuable as that work has been, the present reality is that our department will soon lack the funding to address additional needs resulting from the recent hurricanes and other prior disasters, as well as needs from future storms or other disasters. And that's because the amount of FHWA emergency relief funding being requested from numerous states far exceeds the amount of money that's available. Helene recovery alone will require extensive ongoing investment to permanently rebuild the roads and bridges destroyed by the storm. Meanwhile, we continue to have unmet need for recovery in states like Alaska, Hawaii, Maryland, and Nevada that qualify for FHWA funding to rebuild transportation infrastructure after other recent disasters. With each passing day, we are growing closer to a situation where this department will not be able to provide even partial funding for eligible projects. Consider communities in Arkansas, California, and Oklahoma that have been impacted by floods, tornadoes, and wildfires, or the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Maryland, or the Teton Pass in Wyoming. We currently lack the funds to permanently rebuild the infrastructure in these communities and many others across the country, even though they are eligible. President Biden's requested approximately $8.1 million for the ER program. These funds would cover the backlog of projects waiting for funding, as well as the needs of states from Hurricanes Helene and Milton. I also want to note that in addition to funding for that Federal Highway Administration program, President Biden has also requested $57 million for the Federal Transit Administration's Public Transportation Emergency Relief Program to assist transit agencies that were impacted by and supported local response efforts during Helene, Milton, and other disasters. There is an urgent need today for Congress to act to provide supplemental funding to support communities across this country grappling with disasters. This would not be the first time Congress has risen to the occasion. We saw it after Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Wilma in 2005, more recently in 2018 following Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. Now the American people, including the communities in North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Florida, and Georgia, are counting on Congress to act. As we gather today, we know that investing in resilient infrastructure up front can save lives and reduce the cost of rebuilding. That's why USDOT prioritizes resilient infrastructure in its discretionary grant programs. And through the PROTECT program created through the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're deploying the first ever formula and discretionary funds dedicated to making our infrastructure more resilient. We are seeing the reality of climate change in real time. Weather events that were previously deemed once in a century are coming along every few years. It is not a fluke, it is not a coincidence, and most importantly, it is not going to go away. We need adequate and sustained funding to make sure our communities have what they need to rebuild roads and bridges, to make them more resilient in the face of extreme weather and other disasters, and to help people return to normal life as quickly as possible. With your partnership, I know we can deliver the critical support that's needed right now for our transportation infrastructure, for farmers and ranchers dealing with crop loss, and for families and small business owners who need to rebuild their homes and schools and storefronts and lives. Thank you for welcoming me here today, and I look forward to working alongside you as we help these communities recover and build back stronger and more resilient for the future.
Thank you very much. Administrator Guzman.
Thank you so much, Chair Murray, Vice Chair Collins, and the distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to appear today to discuss the SBA's disaster loan program and the pressing need for additional funding. For decades, SBA disaster loans have been a proven and important resource to help communities impacted by disaster recover and rebuild. SBA offers direct loans to homeowners, renters, businesses, and private nonprofits to help communities get back on their feet. These affordable loans cover disaster losses not fully covered by insurance or other sources and provide much-needed flexibility with low-interest long terms and 1 year of deferred payments and no interest accrual. Harvard University research shows that early access to disaster funding makes a difference in communities receiving more, and those communities receiving more SBA funding are more likely to experience sustained growth versus lagging. In coordination with FEMA, other federal agencies, and state and local entities, SBA helps small businesses prepare for, respond to, recover from, and mitigate against disaster. In fiscal 24 alone, SBA approved over 27,000 disaster loans totaling $1.7 billion and 160 disaster declarations across the 53 states and territories. Behind each loan is a story of a resilient American seeking to rebuild and recover. In Asheville, North Carolina, I met with Biltmore Village restaurant owners whose businesses remained closed while they repaired physical damage after devastating flooding from Hurricane Helene. In Tampa, Florida, I met with the owners of a popular local restaurant who weathered Hurricane Milton but lost power and inventory and were closed for several days. Everywhere I met homeowners dismayed to find out they lacked the coverage for floods and seeking to rebuild, clean up, and stay in their communities. SBA has a vital role to play in the federal disaster response, but the agency's disaster loan program has been unable to meet demand since October 15th, after a surge in demand for disaster loans following Helene and Milton led SBA to exhaust all available subsidy funding for disaster lending. Hours after the president issued disaster declarations for Helene and Milton, SBA staff were on the ground ready to help survivors. SBA has been working around the clock to provide up-to-date, timely information to constituents and minimize the confusion and delays. SBA has also continued to process these loan applications, provide the customer service support, and communicate directly with survivors while we wait for Congress to appropriate the funding to originate new loans and disperse those funds to the more than 12,500 disaster victims who are already in the queue. SBA is currently supporting more than 400 total disaster declarations across the nation and managing a portfolio of 2.5 million loans valued at $285 billion. We have over 3,500 employees that have been deployed supporting loan operations and field operations. And on the ground, we've deployed hundreds of staff across 18 different states to operate more than 175 disaster centers for face-to-face support. However, a lack of SBA disaster funding has impacted recovery across the nation. SBA helps those uninsured or underinsured disaster survivors, as I said, who cannot access credit elsewhere. Homeowners, renters, and businesses are either delaying action or resorting to higher costs of capital. This means there are challenges and delays in rebuilding neighborhoods and reopening small businesses. Homeowners have been unable to access low interest rate loans to remove debris or eradicate mold so they can return to their homes. Survivors who lost a car cannot purchase a new one to take their children to school or get themselves to work. Small businesses cannot replace damaged equipment or inventory or cover economic injury from business disruption. Our disaster-impacted communities need access to SBA loans, and we hope Congress will work quickly to restore funding for this important program. SBA strongly supports the administration's supplemental budget request for SBA's $2.249 billion in funding for SBA's disaster loan program. The administration's request updates the SBA's disaster loan request the administration has been making since the Maui wildfires in 2023. The new $2.249 billion includes vital funding to support disaster lending, as well as the administrative funds the agency needs to process these loans, review for fraud, service, collect, and support disaster survivors on the ground. This funding will allow SBA to immediately begin making approximately $900 million in loan offers to those more than 12,500 approved borrowers waiting in the queue since funds were exhausted. SBA will also continue to process the nearly 48,000 pending loan applications and continue to support new applicants as they continue to come in the door. SBA expects that lending for Hurricanes Helene and Milton will reach significant disaster levels given the widespread damage across multiple states, including in areas not identified as flood zones where lack of insurance was widespread. We have worked closely with the House and Senate Appropriations Committees to provide timely updates about the disaster lending account ever since our 23 supplemental request, in addition to publishing the statutorily required monthly reports. But a series of megastorms such as Helene and Milton show how quickly disaster balances can change. Americans do not know where the next disaster will occur, but helping our fellow citizens recover from disaster is a responsibility we all share. SBA looks forward to working with you to secure those resources necessary to fortify SBA's critical disaster lending program into the future. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Deputy Secretary Torres Small.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair Murray. Thank you, Vice Chair Collins, and thank you, esteemed members of the Appropriations Committee, for convening this crucial discussion on how we show up for American people in the wake of disaster. I ask that you refer to my written testimony for a more complete account of the devastation that farmers, workers, and rural communities have experienced in recent months, and the work USDA has done so far to help them recover. Every time I visit a disaster site, I'm struck by how close we all are to experiencing homelessness, going bankrupt, or relying on a food bank for nourishment. Disasters hit everyone in their path, and no one deserves the punishment of a storm or a fire. Those impacts might include losing your home, losing your business, and if you're a farmer, losing the chance to pass your farm on for future generations. And that's why people work together in the government across political lines, agencies and levels to clear trees, to deliver water and food, and to rebuild roads. We all agree that disaster recovery is an essential role of the government. I think we can also all agree that government can be cumbersome. There are kinks in the system, and I want to talk about those kinks because they slow down the resources that individual families and whole communities need so desperately. Timeliness, flexibility, and fairness must be the North Stars of disaster assistance. For USDA, that comes down to doing all we can to keep farmers farming and support people in rural communities as they rebuild. So I hope we can spend some time talking about operations, how we get resources out the door most quickly and delivered to those who most need them, recognizing that the smallest operators in our food supply chain are essential to that chain and are also often the most at risk of going out of business after a disaster. When government delivers resources in a way that is both timely and fair, we're able to be there for families, for businesses, and communities in their time of need. We're able to build an economic bridge for farmers and producers so they can continue to feed us all. Whenever I think about the storms of 2024, I think about a family-owned and operated pecan farm that I visited in South Carolina this October. Hurricane Helene had destroyed about 75% of this farmer's crop, and about half of his trees will never produce again. His sons had just invested in a processing facility to support their harvest and the harvests of their neighbors. The facility was going to cut transportation costs and add value to the whole community of farmers. But now, there's not enough nuts to process. What struck me most about their story is that while they were waiting out the storm and worrying about the impact on their own future, the farmers' sons put on their rain jackets and went into the storm because they were also members of the volunteer fire department. They were first responders. They were making sure before anything else that their neighbors didn't lose their lives. That's how crucial community is to disaster response. And USDA wants to be part of that community. USDA is part of those communities. And disaster recovery and assistance work is work that we are deeply honored to do. In agriculture, you can't plan for every possible impact. So getting money quickly out to those pecan farmers and to growers and to producers like them is our solemn responsibility. Let's work on that together. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Deputy Secretary Todman.
Good morning, Chairperson Murray, Vice Chair Collins, and members of this august group. It's important for HUD to be here at the table because without the $12 billion that we have requested through the president, simply said, the homes of thousands upon thousands of Americans will never be rebuilt. And their communities will have a housing shortage, the like that they've never seen before. Since I joined the department in 2021, I've traveled to communities after a disaster to talk with people and to gauge the work ahead. In Asheville, in the wake of Hurricane Helene, I met with local leaders, hurricane survivors, small business owners, to learn about what they needed. Similarly, I went to Lee County, Florida, after Hurricane Ian and saw the damage there and heard from the people. I visited Maui after the wildfires, Mayfield, Kentucky, after the tornadoes. And time again, I heard the same thing, how much they needed their national partners to help them recover. And I'm confident that through the concerted unified federal efforts, we will mitigate damage done to communities and rebuild with resiliency. With Congress's support, HUD has provided disaster recovery funds to not only drive the long-term recovery of communities, but also to make sure that those communities are better prepared for when the next disaster strikes. We do this by ensuring that the rebuilding standards address the hazards that these communities are likely to face in the future, and by providing necessary funds to these communities to make their future safer as well. These funds can be spent making homes and other buildings like hospitals and schools stronger, and implement community-wide mitigation projects, and engaging the people in building out what those plans need to be. For instance, in Lockport, Louisiana, $7 million of disaster recovery funds were used to build a new apartment building that could withstand very high winds, and that building was 90% complete when Hurricane Ida hit in August of 21. It was practically unscathed by the storm and was soon completed and was the only rental units available for some time after that event. In Lincoln City, Oregon, HUD Disaster Recovery Fund supported the construction of a 44-unit apartment complex that housed wildfire survivors. In Moore, Oklahoma, after a tornado devastated the Royal Park mobile home community, disaster recovery funds were used to build back 220 homes to help not just folks who were survivors of the tornado, but other community members as well. That is the work that these funds do. And it's so important for this Congress to act with urgency. We must do better. We have a moral obligation to protect people. It takes 4 years today, it takes 4 years from the point of an event for there to be housing substantially built after a disaster. That is far, far too long. That's why, in addition to having the $12 billion available to HUD to help people rebuild, we also need our disaster recovery program to be codified and authorized so that it's there for Americans over and over again, so that we can plan shortly after an event, that local leaders and state leaders can plan as they're in response mode what those long-term recovery needs must be. You know, I feel it was just yesterday, senators, that I had to, on behalf of my family, pull together a care package of batteries, clothing, toiletries, because their home had been severely damaged. It would have been great to share with them that there was a program there ready to make sure that their home could be rebuilt and their neighbor's home as well. When I was in Asheville not too long ago, I met a Mr. Wilson who had a business. And he came up to me, he was a little nervous. I had a little piece of paper in his pocket, he'd opened it up, and I don't know how he did the research, but he did. And Mr. Wilson said, you know, Ms. Todman, we need help. I need your disaster recovery funds, not just for my family and my home, but for my business and to bring my employees back. So let me say, Mr. Wilson, if you're watching this one day, I am here for you. We are here for you and for every other person who's been impacted by these disasters so you can help rebuild your communities. Thank you, Senators. That concludes my testimony.
Thank you. Administrator Criswell.
Thank you and good morning, Chairman Murray, Vice Chair Collins, and esteemed members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding FEMA's supplemental funding request and the Disaster Relief Fund. I'd like to begin by expressing my deepest gratitude to the dedicated leaders joining me at this table and to the broader network of government agencies, the private sector, nonprofits, and others who partner with FEMA every day. Together, we work tirelessly to protect and assist Americans during disasters. Emergency management is built on this collaboration, and it's their partnership that is essential to the daily efforts of FEMA's workforce. Before continuing, I would like to address the recent issue about the FEMA employee who had given instructions to her disaster survivor assistance team that were completely at odds with FEMA's mission. When my senior leadership team informed me of the situation and provided me with the visual evidence that this employee had issued instructions for her team to avoid homes with a specific political affiliation, my leadership team recommended and I directed that we immediately terminate this employee, and we did. In the statement I released the same day of this employee's termination, I repeated to all FEMA employees and the American people that this type of behavior and action will not be tolerated at FEMA. We hold all employees accountable if they violate our standards of conduct. When a disaster strikes, it is collaboration that enables us to respond swiftly and effectively. This spirit of partnership has been especially crucial during the responses to Hurricanes Helene and Milton, where FEMA has mobilized over 10,000 personnel and collaborated with more than 30 federal agencies to ensure critical services and life-sustaining resources reached the hardest hit communities. For example, through collaboration with our partners, FEMA mobilized 24 urban search and rescue teams that included 1,500 personnel, 110 canines, and 90 swiftwater rescue resources to conduct rescue efforts. We also pre-positioned 9 million meals, 10 million liters of water, over 300 generators, and worked closely with the Department of Health and Human Services to deploy medical capabilities, including healthcare site assessment teams and health and medical task forces. These efforts represent the true spirit of FEMA's mission to serve and protect every community. However, we now face significant challenges due to increased disaster demands. FEMA did receive $20.2 billion in the continuing resolution, yet the DRF has been depleted to less than $5 billion as of today, due to the rising operational needs. This shortfall underscores an urgent reality. The DRF needs sufficient funding to handle the scale and intensity of today's disasters, particularly as we face the aftermath of not only Hurricanes Helene and Milton, but also the Maui wildfires and other emergencies. We have over 100 open major disasters and millions of citizens relying on FEMA's support, and our work remains vital to communities in the ongoing recovery process. The surge in demand following recent hurricanes has been unprecedented. In just 1 month, we saw over 2.4 million households register for assistance, breaking records set during previous catastrophic storms. FEMA has already provided more than $7.8 billion in federal assistance for Hurricanes Helene and Milton. And this amount includes $3 billion for individual assistance and $1.7 billion for public assistance. But these needs have rapidly exhausted our available funds, and without a supplemental, our ability to respond to new disasters could be jeopardized. Earlier this year, FEMA recognized we would need to take steps to manage the limited resources by implementing immediate needs funding, or INF. This process allowed us to focus on preserving necessary funding for essential, life-saving, and life-sustaining activities, but required us to pause over $8.8 billion in funding for critical recovery projects across the country. This pause impacted communities across the country, delaying repairs to vital infrastructure and leaving long-lasting effects on communities' capabilities to build back better and stronger. And as the balance of the DRF decreases, we are again assessing whether or not we need to reinitiate immediate needs funding. Our resource needs, however, extend beyond the DRF. Programs like the National Flood Insurance Program are under tremendous strain, with nearly 74,000 claims filed following Hurricanes Helene and Milton, amounting to $843 million. I join the President and urge legislative action to stabilize the NFIP. FEMA faces increased debt and rising interest costs, which threaten the fund's long-term viability. It is very clear that the stakes are high. As our communities face more frequent and devastating disasters, they increasingly rely on FEMA and our federal partners. This is why I strongly encourage Congress to fund all agency requests, as they all support FEMA's work of helping communities recover. For instance, cuts to housing and urban development's housing assistance programs can leave survivors without access to housing and increasing sheltering costs, while reducing funding for Small Business Administration disaster loans limits our business's ability to rebuild. Such shortfalls not only strain FEMA by increasing its workload, but also create coordination challenges among federal agencies, resulting in gaps and inefficiencies in disaster response. Additionally, limited funding for mitigation efforts reduces long-term resilience in affected areas, leaving them more vulnerable to future disasters and intensifying FEMA's burden in subsequent events. The administration's supplemental request is about ensuring that FEMA, along with our federal partners, can meet the demands and provide the assistance needed. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. We will now begin a round of 5-minute questions for our witnesses, and I ask all of our colleagues to please keep track of the clock and try and stay within those 5 minutes. Let me begin. We have heard from all of you, your testimony as well of our colleagues on how bad the conditions are on the ground. I want to start by asking about impacts if Congress were to continue to delay in providing this disaster funding. And Secretary Buttigieg, I want to start with you. DOT has provided $187 million in quick release for states hit by Hurricane Helene to address some of the urgent repairs and ensure the safety of the traveling public. That was a critical, immediate step, and it's left now. I understand the department has less than $120 million remaining for that emergency relief program. If we fail to act quickly, what happens if another hurricane or winter storm hits?
Well, in short, we would be unable to say yes, either in full or in part, to those quick release requests. We work to turn those around in a matter of hours when possible, and we have been able to say yes to 100% to those quick release requests. I'll also note that that figure, $119.6 million, is not just quick release, but the program balance. So in addition to those very quick answers, twice a year we do the allocations for the overall fund, whether that's for recent disasters or ones going back a few years where a community is still in recovery. Those two would be impacted because it's all the same funding. And so very quickly we would be simply unable to support any of these disasters.
Thank you. And Administrator Guzman, in 2024 and 2025, SBA received over 280,000 applications from disaster survivors. That number, I understand, is expected to increase in the coming weeks. And meanwhile, the SBA Disaster Loan Program has been unable to originate new loans for more than 35 days, and 60,000 renters, homeowners, and businesses remain stuck in the backlog now. Talk to us about the impact of this lapse on disaster survivors and explain why we need to provide that funding now.
SBA provides that support for those who don't have insurance or are underinsured. In addition, these are people who do not have credit elsewhere. And so these constituents are faced with higher costs of capital or no capital access at all to be able to rebuild their lives. And so with delays, this further impacts them. As I said, I have nearly $1 billion sitting there waiting to deploy as soon as I get funding, plus the additional 48,000 applications that we are still processing. $30 million a day is what we approve. So the longer this sustains, the further these constituents will not be able to access the program. And I would say that, for the businesses, it's not just the businesses, it's the homeowners, the renters. 70% of our funding goes to homeowners and renters to get back in their neighborhoods.
Right, and if, once we do replenish this account, how long will it take for that money to hit bank accounts once we act?
We would switch back our systems from the technology perspective and hope to get those awards within 24 to 48 hours. However, these are loans. We would need to continue through the process and finalize those loans to disperse dollars within, as fast as 24 hours to up to 2 to 4 weeks.
Okay, thank you very much. Administrator Criswell, the Disaster Relief Fund, as we all know, plays a really major role in helping our communities respond to these disasters. We provided access to over $20 billion in the during the CR period, and the administration's latest request includes another $40 billion. Can you explain how the disaster programs of other agencies impact overall response and recovery efforts, and how these potential funding shortfalls for other disaster programs actually affect FEMA's work?
These disaster programs really work as a holistic way to help communities recover from disasters. While our programs support specific areas like in individual assistance, we can give homeowners that are underinsured or uninsured some funding. Our programs are not designed to replace insurance or make them whole, and that's where these other programs from USDA and SBA, CDBG-DR really come into play to have a holistic approach to community recovery. And without the supplemental disaster funding for all of these agencies, it will slow down recovery in these communities and really making it more difficult for the individuals, homeowners or renters, small businesses, and the community in general to be able to move along quickly in their recovery process.
Thank you. And let me just address this spread of misinformation and disinformation. Just quickly, what is the real-world harm if we see this misinformation, disinformation on communities?
One of the things that we have to do is make sure people have faith in their government and that they know that the programs that they're providing them are going to be there to help them. And when we spread information that is inaccurate about what we are going to do or how we administer our programs, it creates fear, and people don't want to apply for assistance. And these are people that have lost everything, and we need them to be able to have confidence that when they apply for assistance, they're going to get what they need, what they deserve, and what they're eligible for.
Well, thank you. And I know in the past we've seen administrations attempt to withhold disaster funding from states and communities that were affected by some of these devastating disasters. I do think I speak for every member of this committee when I say the spread of disinformation and any efforts by anyone to withhold funds Congress has appropriated for the purpose of assisting communities in their time of need will not be tolerated, whether it comes in the form of a frontline worker or the highest levels of government. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Todman, the funds that HUD provides, the CDBG disaster funds, are awarded to states, to entitlement communities, and to tribes. However, if you look at disasters, they rarely align with those categories. And that raises a lot of concerns for smaller communities who are not going to have control over the funding. Usually it's going to go through the state, for example. How does HUD's administration of the CDBG-DR funds take into account the challenges of these smaller communities and prevent them from encountering delays as they wait for the state to funnel the money to them?
Thank you, Senator. You know, we recognize that that was an issue during this administration, and it's one of the reasons why, in addition to giving funding to states, we also look to give funding to some of our grantees, our pre-existing grantees at the local level. I think one of the things that we're challenged with is for some of those really small communities, they've never done business with HUD before. They've never had to deal with my department. So we want to make sure that they're able to execute and have the capacity. That being said, we do rely on our state partners to do the right thing and get that funding to where it needs to be. So I do look forward to working with you and this committee and your team on better ways that we can execute on that.
Thank you. Secretary Buttigieg, the administration's request includes more than $8 billion for disaster assistance through your department. The vast majority, as you've explained, would be used to help clear the growing backlog of unmet needs within the Federal Highway Administration's Emergency Relief Program. And that backlog includes costs incurred such as $100 million for typhoon damage in Alaska to more than $10 million for 4 severe storm and flooding events in my state. And $7 million of Maine's unmet need is from damage that occurred over a span of just a few weeks in December of 2023 and January of this year. The December storm left 400,000 Mainers without power. This is in a state of only 1.3 million people. And it essentially left the western town of Farmington completely flooded and isolated for a time. Could you give us a better sense of how the $8 billion was calculated? I know you looked at the backlog, but is there also funding for current, more recent storms and upcoming inevitable storms?
So the figure was calculated based on the known backlog. In other words, if we only contemplated those costs that we estimate are already eligible, the $8.1 billion would cover all of that. It does not speak to future disasters, which in principle would be covered through the regular appropriations into this account. Although I would note that level is set at $100 million, and it is not unusual for the account to disperse more than $1 billion in a single year, which is why we've often come to Congress for more funding. In terms of the breakdown, $4.4 billion is for cost estimates for Hurricanes Helene and Milton. Another $1.69 billion is for the Francis Scott Key Bridge replacement. I should note that is net of $350 million, which was removed from that figure because that's going to be recovered via insurance. And any other recoveries that could happen would also reimburse the program and reduce the total. And then the rest is the emergency relief backlog, $2.3 billion, covering disasters in dozens of states, including several in Maine, as you just mentioned.
Thank you. I'm very glad that you clarified the Francis Scott Key Bridge. We had discussed that on the telephone, that this is not 100% federal. It will be net of the insurance recoveries, and I think that's a really important fact. I have many other questions for SBA on how SBA can do a better job in supporting our unique small businesses along the coast, like our lobstermen and our working waterfronts. I'll submit those for the record. Thank you.
Senator Tester.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for not only this hearing, but for your great leadership as your terms as chairman and ranking member of this committee. I have a pressing issue to discuss, but I first want to say a few things about the last 16 years that I have served on this committee. I was recently reminded of a story about a 2013 omnibus. During those negotiations, Congress decided to add a provision to that omnibus bill that would allow Monsanto to continue selling GMO products, even though a federal court had ruled that they no longer could do so. Folks referred to this as the Monsanto Protection Act. I was mad, I was upset, and I voted against that omnibus in 2013 to show everybody how upset I was, even though I was an appropriator. After all, we all know, if you're a policymaker, the easiest vote to make is a no vote on a bill that you know is going to pass. The Appropriations Chair, who is a very strong woman, came up to me at the time and on the floor, in fact, in the cloakroom, and said, I don't think you really want to be an appropriator. And I said, why is that? And she said, because you don't support the committee. We do the hard work, we do what we need to do, we negotiate, and you vote against it. I said, well, I do want to remain on the committee. The answer was yes then, and the answer is yes now. Why? Because there is not a better committee in this body when it comes to solving real problems, providing the oversight that's necessary of our federal agencies, and responsibly allocating resources. This committee has always been the best place to have genuine policy debates on virtually any issue. Some of my favorites over the years, and Senator Moran isn't here right now, was the National Bio and Agro Defense Facility, keeping white potatoes on the WIC list, dealing with the wild horse population, fighting back against unnecessary trucking regulations, and discussing the future of our sugar program. I could go on. Hell, even one time we moved a USD agency to West Virginia. But looking back, I do not regret that vote back in 2013, because I have feelings about what GMOs do to family farm agriculture and to the consumer. And besides that, the provision was unconstitutional. But I did learn a valuable lesson about the beauty of the appropriations process. You get some wins, you get some losses, but when this committee is doing its job, you can count on real debates on real issues that are important to Americans. And once you've won a few arguments and once you've lost a few arguments, you should vote for these bills in this committee and when you get on the floor, because this country is better off when Democrats and Republicans in Congress, and particularly on this committee, can compromise and do their work and set a bipartisan example for the rest of the Senate. I think that is more important in this point in time than it has ever been in this country's history, where division is the biggest problem we have in this country, division among us, when we all know we have much more in common than we have what divides us. So I want to root this committee on into the future. You have a lot of really, really important work to do. The folks sitting around this rostrum can do good work. I've seen it before, and I encourage you to do that. Now I want to speak briefly on a pressing disaster issue in my state, and two items Congress must include in the disaster package. The first is the Fort Belknap Indian Water Rights Settlement Act, and I want to explain why. And the second is an appropriations to continue repairs on the St. Mary's Canal. Right before the August recess, I spoke to this committee about a catastrophic siphon failure on the St. Mary's Canal, which is a vital part of the Bureau of Reclamation's Milk River project. This catastrophic failure is devastating to the small towns that rely on clean drinking water and hundreds of farmers and ranchers who rely on that project for irrigation. Sadly, this failure is not a surprise. The federal government constructed the Milk River project well over 100 years ago. It is an engineering marvel. And despite solid efforts of local residents to keep up with repairs, the system, which spans hundreds of miles, fell into disrepair. In fact, the siphons literally were held together with duct tape and baling wire. And that's why there is no question that Congress needs to step up and address this disaster and make the necessary improvements to this system to ensure that the next failure just isn't around the corner. The good news is I've got legislation that can accomplish this. It's ready to go, the Fort Belknap Indian Community Water Rights Settlement Act of 2024. Years ago, Fort Belknap Indian Community recognized that the Milk River project was a ticking time bomb that threatened access to clean water across the northern tier of Montana for both Indians and non-Indians. With this in mind, and through their strong leadership, they decided as part of the settlement of their waterment claims with the United States, they would contribute significant funds to the settlement to rebuilding the St. Mary's Canal. As a result, a bipartisan bill has already been passed by the Senate twice, this Congress. That's right, twice. The federal legislation is over 2 decades in the making. In fact, I think it's been more vetted more than any other bill that I've worked on in the 18 years I've served in the Senate. It is the right bill for this moment, and it's the right time to get it signed into law with an appropriations to continue repairs on the St. Mary's Canal. I don't have any questions today to the witnesses, but I asked that as the disaster package is finalized, that folks in this committee help address our irrigation disaster in Montana. With that, tally ho, friends, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Hyde-Smith. Thank you, Senator Tester. You will be missed. Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Chair Murray and Vice Chair Collins, and I certainly want to thank everybody on the panel that has come today. And I certainly look forward to discussions on many of these issues with Chairman Schatz, as we've worked very well together. But today, however, I would like to focus on the looming farm crisis in this country. And I'm going to just start with the bottom line up, because we do not have a farm bill. It is absolutely essential that Congress provide emergency assistance for agriculture producers before the end of this year. Even if we passed a farm bill today, under the traditional farm bill structure, assistance would not reach the farmers in time. And the assistance needs to be robust, and it needs to be implemented swiftly. And then the third thing is we must address all types of disasters. And when I say that, I'm referring to natural disasters as well as market-related disasters. I'm the former Ag Commissioner of my state. I'm the former chairman of the Senate Ag Committee in my state and serve on Ag now. I've never had lenders and farm credit lenders and bankers to look at me and say, we are not going to be able to finance these farmers. I've never had that happen until now. Senators Ossoff and Tillis, they did a great job explaining the hardships facing farmers due to natural disasters. But we also need to focus on market disasters as well, which doesn't seem to be getting the proper attention. The devastation of Hurricane Helene is clear, and my heart goes out to those farmers. I've been to North Carolina. I've talked to those people. It is devastating. It's more difficult, however, to discern market-related challenges facing our farm country right now. And I'm talking about a very real crisis rooted in high input costs, rising interest rates, and low commodity prices. The USDA's recent 2024 cost of production reports best illustrates this market disaster. Here's an example of what farm data from the report. It cost an average of $895 to produce 1 acre of cotton in 2024. However, the average revenue generating from that same acre is $569. That is a $326 per acre shortfall loss between expenses and revenues. And we all know that revenues must exceed expenses to make a profit. Losses like this can add up so quickly. If a farmer planted 3,000 acres of cotton this year, that would result in a total net loss income loss of almost $1 million. $978,000 is what that farmer would lose. Obviously, nobody can exist under this. You just can't recover from that. These types of scenario were playing out across the country for all major row crops. These high input and depressed prices are hurting everyone. I mean, we're talking potato farmers, apple farmers, dairy farmers, catfish farmers, you name it. But this year, producers in Mississippi and across the country are reporting some of the best yields ever. That's what's so hard about this. And they did everything right. Yet they will go out of business if they're able to unsecure financing to farm next year. The high costs, the high interest rates, and the low prices is definitely the perfect storm. You may be hard-pressed to find a lender able to finance a farmer who is that deep in the hole, and we understand that. Just like the weather-related disasters, adverse market conditions are completely out of the farmer's control. Examples of the market loss assistance from the past, the ad hoc assistance for farmers is often misconstrued as Congress just responding to damages caused by natural disasters. While natural disasters are a common justification for ad hoc assistance, Congress also approved market loss assistance because of damaging economic effects. We most recently provided economic assistance to farmers in the CARES Act to offset economic disruptions caused by COVID-19. And there are many more examples of Congress doing so during times when crop prices were low. They do not have a safety net. We do not have a farm bill. The Omnibus Appropriations Act of '99 provided more than $3 billion in market loss payments to farmers due to low commodity prices. The FY 2000 Ag Appropriation Bill provided $5.5 billion to compensate growers for the low market prices. The Agriculture Risk Protection Act of 2000 provided money also. So today, the American farmers and ranchers are experiencing literally unprecedented market conditions. So my question, as I'm running out of time here, is to USDA Secretary Troll Small, which I so much appreciate the work you've done. Ms. Secretary, I was pleased that OMB requested the $24 billion, but should Congress provide supplemental funding for market losses, will you work to ensure the department implements those funds in a swift and effective measure?
Senator Hyde-Smith, thank you for your question, and whatever Congress establishes, it is our responsibility to deliver. Also recognize that I've spoken with farmers as well who are struggling, particularly when it comes to input costs. As Congress identifies, makes the hard choices about disaster funding as well as other economic assistance in the wake of fiscal conservatism, we know that we've got to look deep into which farmers are struggling. And so that same report you referenced does also acknowledge that in the last 4 years, total average net farm income has been up above the 20-year average, including one banner year, and the rest of the years all above 2014, or all as high as they'd been since 2014. So that means we've really got to dive into those details about who are the farmers who are struggling and how do we support them, both this time and tracking a future where we're taking on challenges like domestic fertilization production and increased market opportunities.
Yeah, with the high cost and the interest rates, I mean, we're expecting to lose 20% of good producers. So I do think this is a true emergency and a crisis for our farmers. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chair Murray. Thank you, Ranking Member Collins, and to each of the administration officials who've testified today. Thank you for your heart, your time, your effort. We heard from each of you the stories of individuals you've connected with and where you've gone and visited, and from the folks in your agencies who are doing the very hard work of helping the people, of course, of Georgia and North Carolina, but so many other states across our country recover from disasters. This is one thing that really should bring all of us together, and I'm grateful for the work of this committee and of your agencies. I have two things I wanted to mention. Senator Tillis, in a compelling opening statement, said we have to deliver aid differently in response to disasters. Senator Murkowski and I have a bipartisan bill that's both bipartisan and bicameral, has a wide number of co-sponsors that would compel a federal resiliency strategy. More than a dozen states around the country, my home state of Delaware, her home state of Alaska, as well as the states of North Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Michigan, have state resiliency officers or state resiliency commissions. And Administrator FEMA says that every dollar we invest in resiliency before disaster strikes saves $6 in post-disaster recovery. Could you just briefly speak to whether it is worth our having a national resiliency strategy, a chief resiliency officer, and what our country might gain in terms of reducing the damage of disasters as the frequency and intensity of them seems to continue to steadily rise?
Senator Coons, we have seen an increase in the number of severe weather events, but not just the number, the complexity and the impacts that they're costing, and it's making the recovery harder. But I have also seen, as I have traveled across the United States, where we have invested in resiliency and we have seen minimal damage, proof that that investment makes a big difference in helping
So what would the value be of
recover.
having a national strategy and a single coordinating office or officer?
I think what we need is more communities to understand this better, and if we can have a coordinated effort through a national strategy, it would help communities develop this type of resilience plan.
Let me raise one other thing if I could. We're celebrating the 30th anniversary of AmeriCorps this year. And in response to disasters, AmeriCorps members from all over the country redeploy to help with response assistance. In North Carolina and in Florida, nearly 500 AmeriCorps members have been on the ground in communities. Our former colleague, Senator Blunt, was really struck by how in Joplin, Missouri, when they were hit by a horrific tornado, it was weeks and months later, AmeriCorps members who remained on the ground helping with rebuilding housing, with responding to the community, and with delivering services. The AmeriCorps members who are serving in North Carolina and Florida have embedded with FEMA, have worked with local faith organizations, civic and community organizations, helped deliver everything from wellness checks to folks who are isolated due to a lack of transportation or power access, or who simply need grocery gift cards or access to clean water. The supplemental requests $80 million for AmeriCorps. It is a tiny amount out of this very large bill. But I just wanted to take a minute and ask if I could, Administrator, if you see value in having these AmeriCorps members continue to be a part of your disaster response teams, helping fix up damaged schools and homes and helping clear debris, and whether you think this is an urgent and important piece of this supplemental.
Senator, I talked in my opening about how this is about partnerships, and AmeriCorps is one of our best partners. The AmeriCorps teams go in the field and they do things like staff call centers. Like you said, they muck and gut homes. We mission assign them and bring them in to help us in communities. In fact, we've mission assigned them 7 times in 2024. And they are such a critical partner to helping these communities, helping these homeowners with things that they can't do on their own. I mean, we also partner with them to create the FEMA Corps program, where we have hundreds of FEMA Corps members that actually supplement our workforce in times of need, go out into communities and help us deliver our programs. These programs are critical for the holistic approach to delivering disaster aid.
Each of your agencies has an articulated relationship, either like FEMA Corps directly or indirectly through grantees. And I'd urge you to look at ways that AmeriCorps members can help expand the reach and impact. If I could, Mr. Secretary, just one last question. The Key Bridge was a critical artery, not just for Baltimore, but the whole East Coast. It impacted the Port of Wilmington as well as our community. We worked alongside the folks who've been engaged in that urgent recovery. Why should the federal government pay some portion of the reconstruction of this bridge? There's at least one member of the Senate who seems to press back on the idea of having the federal government cover the costs of reconstructing the Key Bridge. Are there other examples of the federal government doing this, and is it critical to the timely and complete recovery of the infrastructure of the Mid-Atlantic?
Well, certainly we regard this as the sort of disaster that is why we have an emergency relief program. Some of them are natural disasters, others are disasters like the destruction of the Key Bridge, something that is of not just local or regional but national significance when you consider its impact on supply chains. And of course, this is something that happened through no fault of the communities that were directly impacted. I should take the opportunity to clarify the numbers I stated earlier to Vice Chair Collins. I realize the 1.69 figure is before we netted out the 350. So the correct answer would be 1.69 less 350 is what is contemplated in the request. But again, that principle is we will recover some funding through things like the insurance, but the rest of it the President has committed to provide because, again, this is what we do for any community that is hurting, and certainly when there is an asset of national significance like the Francis Scott Key Bridge.
For better or worse, all of us at some point will be asking for urgent disaster response funding, and I think that's a key part of this committee and our work together. And I also recommend to all of my colleagues the bipartisan bill that Senator Murkowski and I have to invest more in resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Fisher.
Thank you to the chair and ranking member for having this hearing today, and thank you to all the members of the panel for coming. Director Criswell, as you know, Nebraska saw 5 separate major disasters declared in 2024. And I've heard from communities across the state that have faced lengthy delays due to FEMA processing and the red tape that takes place in bureaucracies. Many of these communities are still in the process of recovering from the 2019 flooding along the Missouri River. One example that I have recently was in the city of Plattsmouth, which backs up against the Missouri. The city has waited nearly all of this calendar year on a very minor scope of work change request. And these are small rural communities with limited resources, and they're really doing the best they can to support their residents. I can appreciate you and your best, that you're doing that, your best with the resources and the staff that you have. But the issues I'm talking about here aren't ones of manpower. It's not one of logistics. It's paperwork. It's red tape. Will you commit to working with my office and the Nebraska Emergency Management Agency to ensure that these impacted communities can receive timely responses and are not subject to these really, really long delays, which we all know add costs to the project in the long term?
Senator Fisher, I've been a local emergency manager, and I understand what they're going through. You definitely have my commitment, and we are looking always for ways to reduce the bureaucracy, like recently changing the small project threshold to $1 million to reduce some of that paperwork burden for these smaller communities. We'll continue to work with you, and if you have the specific case, I'll look into it personally.
Okay, great. We'll be in touch, and Plattsmouth will be happy to hear that hopefully we'll get some of that red tape cut for them soon. Secretary Buttigieg, nice to see you. I've heard from state DOTs that there's a lack of consistent guidance from the U.S. DOT regarding the requirements needed for states to justify building back better after a disaster. The ability for state DOTs to efficiently use federal funds to prevent future infrastructure damage is imperative. How is U.S. DOT ensuring that clear and consistent guidance is being provided to our state DOTs on the resilience eligibility for reimbursement after a disaster?
I think your question captures the fact that in many cases it doesn't make sense to replace something in the exact form fashion that it was designed 30, 50, or 100 years ago, especially in the face of increasingly severe and frequent extreme weather. Our programs do contemplate the ability to do that, and we work to make sure not only is there a categorical exclusion designed to cut the red tape for projects that simply are about replacement, but that there's support for enhancing and increasing the resiliency of what is designed, including knowing sometimes a significant design change is appropriate given what might have just been learned. The statute does constrain us in some ways, but often it is possible within the framework of statute to justify those improvements or betterments by showing that if you consider the reduced risk, there really is a cost benefit to those improvements. Would be happy to work with you or your team or any other states that you have spoken with on any specific cases where they're trying to get the right flexibility. We'll do whatever we can to support them.
I'd be interested in hearing any suggestions you may have. I know we're on a short time frame, but to hear any suggestions you may have when you reference the existing statutes that we have to work with now. What can we do in a new Congress, most likely when we're looking at another transportation bill, to be able to use our resources in a responsible manner, but also to move projects quicker? If you have specific changes, I'd really be interested in hearing some of those.
Would welcome a chance to work with you on that. Should I preview them now or just?
No.
All right, we'll get back to you on that. Thanks very much.
I have another question for you. While I have you here, within days of that 2019 major flooding event that hit Nebraska, NDOT requested quick response emergency funding from FHWA. However, it took the agency over 3 years to release the quick release funds that were there. These funds that are to be used for priority emergency repair work on federal aid routes. So why isn't FHWA able to reimburse for emergency repairs in a more reasonable amount of time And again, do you have any ideas on how to make that process go more quickly in the future? I would really like to see that happen.
I'm not familiar with what took place in 2019 before we arrived, but what I will say is that our goal and generally our practice in recent disasters has been to turn around a quick release request the same day. Now, that does involve working closely with the Department of Transportation involved to identify those dollars that are really going to be needed right away and can be put to use first versus those that are more appropriate for a semi-annual allocation. But in both instances, whether we're talking about a foreseeable longer-term expenditure or something where we're talking about slope stabilization or rerouting traffic, something you need right away, that funding is no barrier to those on the ground trying to get that problem solved, and want to continue to engage on any refinements to the program that would help with that. I will note the Federal Highway Administration is in the process of a full overhaul and revision of the ER manual that lays out a lot of those procedures, and I'm hopeful that that will bring additional clarity and refinement to the process that might have helped in the situation you were describing.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Vice Chair. I want to thank all of the appointed officials who have done an extraordinary job in helping us to recover from the Maui wildfires. I think everybody knows the story. A very small, discrete, compact town was 100% leveled, incinerated in a matter of hours. And more than 100 people died. And we are dealing with the consequences going forward. But I want to deal in facts now. Because as Senator Tillis said, the media has moved on from the spectacular and terrifying suffering. And yet people are still suffering. So let me start with Secretary Todman. How many structures were destroyed in the Lahaina fire?
My team advised me that there is about 4,000 residential units that were destroyed.
4,000 housing units, 90% of the impacted area, 2,200 structures. And about how many people does that represent?
Probably 2.5 times that number, sir.
Yeah, so it's about 12,000. So one of the things that you need to know about Lahaina and Hawaii generally is you have a lot of multi-generational families, so that per house, but the number of people per household is way higher. So you have about 12,000 people without a home. And I want everyone to listen to this one. How many homes have been rebuilt?
We took a look at the Maui County Recovery Dashboard. It appears that there's just one, sir.
One home rebuilt. 116 permits issued. Over the last 15 months, 16% of the survivors who are housed but not in their own home, sorry, not 16, 60% of the survivors have moved at least 3 times. 20% of the survivors have moved 5 times. The problem is housing. The Federal Emergency Management Agency did a good job with the Army Corps of clearing the debris and making it safe to walk around. The soil is safe. The infrastructure is coming back online. The problem is housing, and the way to rebuild a community is CDBG-DR. And I want to make 2 points about CDBG-DR. The first is the practical impact of a lack of an authorization. We are currently digging a trench for temporary infrastructure with FEMA money in partnership with the county. And it is, I mean, it's expensive to do anywhere, I get it, but it is really expensive to dig a trench on Maui. More than Oahu, by the way. It's already expensive in Hawaii generally. We just picked the most difficult, most time-consuming, most expensive place to try to dig a trench. And as soon as we get that DR money, they're gonna have to dig it back up. So if anybody thinks a lack of an authorization for this program, which we annually put money towards, It's not as if you're being a fiscal conservative by not authorizing this program. You're just ensuring it is done in the maximally stupid way. We have a bipartisan bill that could fix this pretty narrow problem. It wouldn't cause a penny of additional federal resources to be spent. It would just ensure that when the two secretaries get together and think about disaster response and disaster recovery, that they could do it together and act like smart public administrators who don't want to waste money. They are being forced to waste money because of the lack of an authorization. And so, Secretary Todman, I'm sorry, I was supposed to ask more questions, but I got a little wound up. Secretary Todman, I want you to just walk us through what the human impact will be, set the DR authorization aside, if we don't fund CDBG DR for Maui. What will happen to these Maui families?
Well, I think that at some point, there's going to be a need to shut down some of the temporary housing arrangements that families have, and notwithstanding, I'm sure, what will be great attempts by the governor and the Maui County mayor and yourself, some of those people will leave Maui. Some of those folks, if they don't find a home, may be rendered homeless, which of course is not something any of us want. But inevitably, not having those homes rebuilt means that Maui will continue to have an acute housing crisis, which it had even prior to the wildfires. So I think it will impact not just the victims and the survivors, but everybody who lives on the island.
Thank you, Secretary, and thank you to all of you. We are about to, hopefully, spend some number of tens of billions of dollars on disasters across the country. But as Senator Tillis said, and Senator Fisher said, and I am trying to emphasize, we don't have to do it unintelligently. And so I know we're appropriators and not authorizers, but we are all members of the United States Senate who have influence and who sit on authorizing committees. There is no reason we should spend this amount of money in a way that is so clunky that the aid doesn't get to the people or that we spend more money than we ought to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Bozeman.
Thank you. Thank all of y'all for being here. We do appreciate your hard work. Secretary Torres Small, we appreciate you very much. I've enjoyed working with you the last several years, and I know you've been out and about as much as anybody. I think about you being in Arkansas and at one of our smaller communities, and then a person from an even smaller community being there and talking about our water problems, and as a result of your leadership and everyone working together, I think we were able to put together a project that was really the last biggest group of people that didn't have water. I think it was 500 families now have water as a result of that. So that's those are good things, and I know you've worked really hard to do that. I'm a little bit concerned about USAID and their response to what's going on right now, though, in the sense, you mentioned that agriculture is at the 20-year average. 20-year average doesn't mean anything right now. There's no person working in America that wants to be at the 20-year average. Boeing has struck, all of these different areas that we see. They're not asking for a 20-year average or a whatever. They're wanting 20, 30, 40% increases. And so I agree with Senator Hyde-Smith. It's really dire in farm country right now. So the other thing that I think is unfair is that when you talk about agriculture at the 20-year average, if you're growing, if you're producing cattle, things like that, it's very, very good. If you're growing something in the ground right now, it's very, very bad. And so I haven't been around here forever, but I've been around here for a while, and I've never been in a situation where the bankers are coming in saying, if you don't do something, we're not going to be able to, because of our bank examiners, we're not going to be able to provide the credit that our farmers need. That's not the 20-year average. It's not a rosy picture. It's a very dire picture. So I would agree with her from being out in the field, and many of you on the committee as they were home campaigning, being among rural America, were texting me, what about the farm bill? What are we doing? How's it coming? Because they were hearing from their producers. But this is really a critical situation. And so I'd really like for you to talk a little bit more about that. And again, you're out and about as much as anyone. Can rural America endure this without significant help?
Just yesterday, I was talking with rice farmers from Arkansas and also Mississippi, and they showed me a graph where there really are challenges, because although we continue to work to drive down the cost of food, and we've also seen that reflected in terms of international commodity prices, we haven't necessarily been able to stem inflation, but there's still high prices for things like fertilizer. There's a real challenge to retain and pay farm workers. And there continue to be challenges with interest rates. So I've certainly talked with farmers who are struggling. And I know they're very eager. I think we're pleased to see both versions of the Farm Bill. They're very eager to see movement on that, particularly with the dairy cliff coming in December. And I am also eager to have a conversation about how we support farmers, recognizing that there is a climate of fiscal responsibility, and diving into those details about who really is hurting will benefit both the short term as well as the long term. How do we build back so that we're both supporting existing farmers but investing in future opportunities for future farmers?
Have you talked to lenders?
I have, absolutely.
What are they saying?
Recognize there are concerns about lending in several markets, both in terms of commodities, but also in terms of specialty crops, as well as biofuels and biodiesel. And we, as lenders ourselves, are still seeing strong repayment. So we do know that at the same time, there are opportunities for farmers out there, and we continue to work to make sure our loans are as accessible as possible.
Right. Secretary Buttigieg, thank you for being here. One of the things that we're concerned about is, as we have these disasters and this and that, and we have destruction, and then rebuild back, are we doing it in such a way to make it such that we're going to be more resilient to future situations that occur? Do you feel comfortable in that regard, or are there more resources or more research that we need to be doing in regard to that?
The good news is we're taking steps that weren't possible before the bipartisan infrastructure law, the PROTECT program in particular, largely through formula going to states as well as discretionary awards. This is the first ever dedicated federal program, and it's north of $7 billion to help with resilience projects. But I believe the need for resilient construction and reconstruction is only going to grow. And as Congress contemplates the next, whatever the successor to IIJA is, I think it'll be important to take on board the data points, both in terms of the early successes we've seen with PROTECT and the mounting need and the likelihood that it will only be more acute in the years to come.
Good. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Boozman. Senator Reed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Let me begin by thanking Secretary Buttigieg for the tremendous assistance with our Washington Bridge problem. We had a major bridge system that connects essentially the east and west sides of the Providence metropolitan area. One side had to be shut and demolished. The Secretary has been very, very helpful in providing grant money of about $221 million. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, really appreciate it. And your personal appearance up there, and I hope you enjoyed lunch in East Providence, but thank you very much. There's another issue that I'd like to raise that is, I've tried to incorporate in the disaster loan supplementals, and that's LIHEAP. Senator Collins and I have been leading the way on LIHEAP for many, many years. And for people who cannot keep their home warm in the winter or cool enough in the summer, that's something of a disaster. President Biden requested $1.6 billion last year. It was not granted. And we are already behind, I think, in terms of preparing for that. But having those issues aside, let me address Administrator Guzman. Again, related to the Washington Bridge disaster, there were a lot of small businesses affected. And I thank you and your team for distributing about $47 million in EIDL loans. However, I've heard from many of the local and small businesses that it was very slow, very timely, very difficult to understand. So how can Congress help SBA provide a smoother EIDL application process?
Well, thank you for that, Senator. And yes, we are proud to be able to support over 600 loans to those affected by the Washington Bridge collapse. SBA this year has transformed its lending program under the disaster loan program. We've relaunched a new platform that is now available. It takes about 14 minutes to apply for an SBA loan now. We've cut down processing from 100 days to 50 days with the investments that we've put into streamlining and simplifying our system as much as possible. So we're on the right track to continue to try to improve the systems and improve the experience for disaster survivors across the country. I will say that as we move towards continuing to try to help as many of those individuals as possible, recognizing that there are some declines, this is a loan, we are aggressively focusing on reconsideration processes and making sure that a no isn't just a final no, that we're able to provide assistance to redirect, reconsider, as well as support them on the ground with the full suite of SBA resources, our small business development centers, our women's business centers, et cetera. As we continue to try to make these improvements into the future, clearly our on-the-ground presence, the administrative funding that we need to support disasters is really critical. That's the foot soldiers who are on the ground helping people understand, those who have difficulties, helping them through that process as swiftly as possible. I will say as well, we're trying to implement policy with an administrative authority to simplify our loans, granting that 12-month of deferment on payment and interest, but also simplifying unsecured financing.
Thank you very much. Administrator Criswell, one of the best ways to avoid a disaster is pre-disaster mitigation. I know your agency has several programs that does that. And last spring, we discussed my concerns about the difficulty of accessing these programs. Many of my communities will have plans, will go forward, but they often get the answer no. So what can we do to get these pre-disaster mitigation programs in place to avoid the cost and the difficulties of disasters?
Yes, Senator, I appreciate that conversation because pre-disaster mitigation is so critical, and it's going to continue to be more critical with the increase in disasters. We've made some changes to our program by reducing the discount rate to be able to make it more competitive, also being able to give additional points through the scoring system on our competitive grants for those that have never received a grant before, or those that lived in areas or live in areas where they don't have the resources that major urban areas may have. I'm committed to continuing to work with you and understand the barriers that these communities are facing, especially those that have the highest risk. And part of our process is now using our community disaster resilience zone identification to better identify the communities that need additional assistance to help them be competitive and be able to get this critical funding to help them become more resilient.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Reed. Senator Moran.
Sure, everyone. Thank you very much, Vice Chairwoman. Thank you. I have so many questions and so little time. I want to use some of my time to make a few comments. But let me start with indicating my sharing concerns with my colleagues who spoke previously, the senator from Mississippi and the senator from Alabama, and what I expect the senator from North Dakota to say. Drought is a damning circumstance in many places across the country, and especially at home in Kansas. 79% of the acres in Kansas have been under some form of drought, most of it severe for the year. We have reduced 79% of our wheat crop that we have not had a wheat crop this small since 1961 because we can't grow a crop. You add that to all the other features of high input costs, low commodity prices, high interest rates, and the damage is real. Drought is no disaster is anything easy to experience. And we have our share of other kinds of disasters in Kansas, most notably tornadoes. But drought is something that is so discouraging, so depressing. We have a tremendous increase in the number of mental health and indications in regard to our farming population. I know how it must feel to be a farmer whose great-grandfather succeeded in keeping the farm together, their grandfather, their father, and now it becomes the time, and I should say grandmother and mother, keeping this farm together. But today's farm family, they have this sense that if they did it, why can't I? I'm a failure. And drought is this depressing thing that weighs on a farmer every day. Even I from here look at the weather, the radar every day to see if there is any hope. And I want to stress to my colleagues on the committee the importance of the agriculture disaster. I don't want to say how many years I've been in Congress, but I would say that I've been on the Ag Committee or the Ag Appropriations Subcommittee all of my time here. And this is as dire a circumstance that I can see in my time in trying to address the saving of rural America. So this is not something that we ought to consider unimportant. It is hugely important. I would tell you, Secretary Small, that I do think that this committee, the Congress, ought to be prescribing in giving the Department of Agriculture specific directions about how ag disaster funds should be spent without some, but also with some level of flexibility to take care of the things that we may have missed. But I also want to have mentioned you, Secretary Small. You said something that I'd highlight for you is important. This will seem out of off point, I suppose. But we are battling OSHA with new rules in regard to safety for firefighters. Almost 90+% of our firefighters in Kansas are volunteers. And the OSHA rules and regulations that they are proposing will eliminate the capability of small-town Kansas and small-town America. We have a noon whistle in my hometown that sounds at noon, but it sounds when there's a fire. And as you said, when you saw the volunteers that run to the rescue, others have testified to people who have lost their own homes but come to the rescue of their neighbors. Those are volunteer firefighters across Kansas, and I would encourage the Department of Agriculture to express the importance of that, the role of firefighters, as OSHA makes its final determination about these rules. Then, Ms. Guzman, Secretary or Administrator, we have SBA loans that come from the days of the pandemic, IDEL, and Paycheck Protection. Our Wichita Regional Office is working closely with us, but what happened in too many instances was people who claimed to be somebody else and got those loans, and now the people who are paying the price for that fraud are the people who the SBA and the Treasury Department are pursuing for repayment of loans they never made, never applied for, and never received. And I just would encourage you to again reach out and find a way to put the misery that these individuals are going through no fault of their own, that the circumstances they find themselves in. And then finally, to a more germane perhaps topic, again, what I think I said is important in all ways of how we fight disasters and how comprehensive the problem is at home. But I also would add, nothing is included in this appropriations bill at this point in regard to NASA. And Senator Shaheen and I are responsible in some ways, many ways, for the appropriations for NASA and the disasters that they've experienced over a long period of time, including in Guam, as well as Kennedy, Johnson, and Stennis, are dramatic and huge and damaging to the capability of NASA to fulfill its mission. Finally, what I want to make certain is I want to express my disgust, dissatisfaction. I sound bold when I say disgust, then I feel I feel uncomfortable being that way, and I changed the word to dissatisfaction, excuse me. Disgust and dissatisfaction about our inability to do an appropriation bill for 2025 in this committee, in this session, before the end of the year. And it seems one more time we're going to fail to have that opportunity because decisions made elsewhere. I use that to say that, in my view, this committee, the discussions we had in the reorganization of the Republican conference this year revolved around how to get the Senate to work again and for us to have meaningful work to do. And the answer every time is let the committees do their work. And I'm fearful that in this instance of this disaster program, that once again, this will be shuffled off to somebody else, not the Appropriations Committee, to complete the details. And I would urge the leadership of this committee and all of us to lobby our leaders to remind them that this is the committee that should have jurisdiction over what we're talking about today. And this should not be a one-shot hearing with the administrators of the various agencies and departments that are affected by this. This ought to be our work from now till the end of the year. We claim, and I believe it's true, we have the time to complete the full FY25 appropriation bill, if we're not going to do that, we certainly have the time to be the committee that's responsible for the work that's before us today. Thank you.
Well, amen, Senator Moran. I would bet the entire committee support your disgust. Senator Baldwin.
Thank you. And I'll associate myself with those comments also. I want to thank the chair and vice chair for hosting this vital hearing today to discuss the administration's request for a response to recent natural disasters. I will add that the administration's request includes just about $4 billion in supplemental funding within the jurisdiction of the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education Subcommittee. And this funding is such that has routinely been included in prior disaster supplementals. It is intended to address critical needs in areas affected by natural disasters related to health care, mental health care, child welfare, aging and disability services, child care, and education, among others. And so I hope to ensure that in any supplemental that communities have access to those necessities also. I want to associate myself with Senator Moran's comments, global comments, but also about the impact of disasters on rural America and in my state, in particular, to the dairy industry. Ms. Torres Small, I wrote to the Department of Agriculture this summer to sound the alarm on challenges that Wisconsin dairy farmers were facing due to no fault of their own. These are things like extreme weather events, drought, as was mentioned by Mr. Moran, highly pathogenic avian influenza, and the high input costs of fuel and fertilizer. They have shared their concerns with me as they strive to recover from these challenges. However, they have found that existing resources and risk management tools at the USDA do not meet their needs. Last Congress, as then chair of the Agricultural Appropriations Subcommittee, I made the request of the agency to establish a direct assistance program for organic dairy farms facing similar challenges. Your agency responded by creating the Organic Dairy Marketing Assistance Program, and it has been a resounding success, providing multiple rounds of direct assistance to the organic dairy sector. Given the success of that program in addressing challenges faced by the organic sector, do you think a comparable direct financing assistance program for conventional dairy would help mitigate the loss of family farms in a state like Wisconsin?
Thank you very much, Senator Baldwin, for your advocacy for our dairy farmers and our dairy industry. It's crucial to all of us that we have the national milk supply and we maintain the national milk herd. We worked incredibly hard on the organic program, CCC program, and part of the reason we focused on that is because it was an opportunity to also add value for dairy farmers, particularly smaller dairy farmers that might struggle solely as price takers when it comes to milk as a commodity. But we recognize that there's there's lots of ways that we need to support milk and dairy farmers. So other things that we're working on, of course, we also used funding from the CCC to provide support for not only dairy farmers that had experienced H5N1 on their dairies, but also to support them to keep them from getting it in the future, funding robust testing as well as plans for biosecurity and also opportunities for PPE for farm workers. So we continue to work very hard to work with dairy farmers to fight potential H5N1 circumstances. And of course, we would do anything, implement any program that Congress were to create to address farm stress and challenges.
I do want to get a couple more questions in. So I also want to draw to your attention the Livestock Indemnity Program was designed to provide relief for farmers suffering livestock losses due to severe weather events. McFarlane Pheasants in Wisconsin is the largest pheasant producer in the country. They were denied assistance despite losing over 50,000 birds due to an E2 tornado in this past summer. After my office conducted casework on the farmer owner's behalf, we learned that USDA denies these claims and discourages farmers from applying because USDA interprets the statute as excluding game birds. And I don't agree, and I want to see this change. Given the increasing frequency of severe weather events and the critical financial impact of them on farmers, is the USDA prepared to reconsider its interpretation of the Livestock Indemnity Program eligibility criteria?
We'll continue to discuss with you that interpretation. As you know, the statutory language allows for poultry for commercial use. And since 2009, USDA has had this regulation that did not allow coverage for birds that are used for hunting. And so we would love to follow up with you. Know that also as the Farm Bill is being discussed, it might be an opportunity to clarify congressional intent.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. Senator Hoeven.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So I'm going to follow up on comments by both Senator Boozman and Senator Moran. And Secretary Torres Small, good to see you again. Thanks for being in our state and for a lot of the good work that you do. Appreciate having you here today. Senator Boozman talked about 20-year average income. Now just think about that for a minute. That probably puts you 50% below your actual costs. If you were getting your, figure out your pay for the last 20 years and you're getting the average, the 20-year average, and then figure out what your expenses are today, your fuel, your fertilizer, and everything else, you're way below cost. So number one, across the country, that's what our farmers are seeing, right? And just to really pound home what that means. Second, point that Senator Moran made, he talked about drought. 48 states have reported drought this year. Last I checked, there's only 50. 48 states reported drought. So you can see the kind of stress that our farm, now everybody knows about the hurricanes and the disasters and all that, you see it on television and everything else, but that's the rest of the story that has really put our farmers and ranchers up against it. So the key here is that we not only provide this disaster assistance, but that you work with us, that USDA works with us so that we structure it right, not only in terms of making it effective to meet the need, but to help us get this farm bill done so that when our producers go in, and I think it was Senator Boozman talking about, or maybe one of the others, that they can get a plan and get credit to farm next year. We're losing farms at a high rate, and the farms we're going to lose as a result of these disasters and the drought and everything else are the ones that are on the edge. Those are the ones that get hit the hardest, right? So, I ask for your assurances that you will work with, because we've worked with WIP Plus, we work with the ERP, which is what Secretary Vilsack modified the program to be, and sometimes it's worked and sometimes it hasn't, but will you commit to work with this committee to structure this, not only for best advantage in the disaster package, but to help us get this farm bill done?
Thank you, Senator Hoeven, for your collaboration. It's a joy to get to work with you. When it comes to, I do want to briefly address the net farmer income, because when we talk about net farmer income, what I mentioned is the last 4 years, one has been a banner year, setting record numbers. The other three have all been within the 20-year national average, but also higher than they've been since 2014. So there was a real lull in between 2014 and these last 4 years where we saw even lower net farm income. That being said, I have talked with farmers who are struggling. I know that we need to work to make sure that farmers both are able to make ends meet now and in the future, and we are committed to working with you in any technical assistance that's needed.
And I know you pretty well, and I know you understand the problem. I understand you have a job to, defend some of the statistics that USDA is putting out there, but average expenses are way above that average income. That's a problem. Agreed?
We will continue to work together to drive down input costs, but net income includes costs.
But more importantly, how we structure, let's get to the heart of the question is your willingness to work with us now on structuring this the right way. I'm pretty sure the answer is yes, knowing you, but I want to hear it.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. The second thing is, and you've been to our state and you've been good about coming, we had not only drought but wildfires, and I don't know if you're aware of that, but our livestock producers, as well as livestock producers across the country, are going to get help. And so again, and I know you have knowledge in that area, but your commitment in terms of making sure that those livestock programs are addressed as well.
Yes, so we'll continue to work to look at LIP and ELAP and what we can do for water hauling as well as transportation of cattle in the face of a disaster.
Okay, thank you. And we, again, on behalf of the Full Appropriations Committee, the Ag Appropriations Committee, and the Ag Authorizing Committee, we want to work closely with you on this. And so we appreciate you being here today, and again, your willingness to work with us. Director Criswell, how can we be sure that, by the way, you were in North Dakota in 2011 when we had flood up there. More than 4,000 homes in a relatively small community were flooded out completely. So, I know you know firsthand of what it's like to work on the ground with people that have been hard hit. How can we be assured that FEMA will fairly and impartially address every single person that's affected by any kind of disaster, given what happened earlier after those hurricanes in the Southeast? How can we be sure that you're on top of that and that kind of incident won't happen and that people won't be unfairly treated?
Yes, Senator Hoeven, yes, I spent 7 months in your lovely state with that disaster, and I know firsthand how people are impacted. And our goal as an agency is always to treat everybody fairly and equally and ensure that they have access to our programs. The incident that happened in Florida is simply unacceptable. And I have instituted an investigation. I have reached out to the IG and asked for an independent investigation of this incident. I have sent an email out to our workforce, and we have provided refresher training to all of our staff in the field to ensure that this type of behavior never happens again. People are at their worst day. They deserve their government to be able to help them, and you have my commitment to make sure that if we find any other instances, we will take appropriate disciplinary action.
Yeah, it is critically important that people understand that and that it's transparent so that they can have confidence in FEMA.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Heinrich.
Administrator Criswell, I, as I've expressed to you, am extremely disappointed that so many New Mexicans continue to wait for relief and compensation that they're owed through the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon Claims Office. And so I want to ask you, what can FEMA do differently so that the folks who literally lost everything in the fire are not the last to get their compensation?
Yeah, Senator Heinrich, I appreciate your continued work with my department, my agency, the staff that are in the field to make sure that everybody in New Mexico that was impacted by these horrific fires gets the compensation they need. We have increased our staffing significantly throughout the year, and we have increased the number of claims that are being paid out as a result of that. To date, we have over $1.5 billion that have gone into the hands of people, but we know we have more work to do. We continue to bring in our staffing and ensure that we have the right amount of people, the right amount of resources to
It seems like the people
them.
who are hit the hardest, though, are at the tail end of getting compensated, that the simple claims have moved, and the more complicated but also more devastating claims are often the ones that are not getting done in a timely way.
We are working with each person individually, Senator, as they each have their own unique experience. And the more complicated ones require additional information, and that's why we want to have the appropriate amount of staff increased our staffing so we can work with each family, each individual to understand their specific needs, get that documentation, and get them the reimbursement that they're eligible for.
The President's supplemental budget request includes transfer authority for an additional $1.5 billion to compensate those victims. What would be the impact on my constituents if that funding is not approved?
The current authorization was for $4 billion, and we had an independent actuarial report recently that shows that this is not going to be sufficient.
Right.
And we expect it to be somewhere over $5 billion, and it may even go higher. Without that ability to transfer that funding, we can meet claims today, the claims that we have had submitted, but I will not be able to meet.
Down the road, that would not be
I
the
will not
case.
be able to meet the claims down the road based on what I believe is an accurate report from this independent actuary.
Administrator Guzman, SBA loans, as we've heard repeatedly from my colleagues today, are literally a lifeline for families and businesses and nonprofits that are recovering from flooding from New Mexico to North Carolina. We've had severe floods in Roswell and Chavez County in New Mexico in recent weeks. Last week, I joined Senators Tillis and Budd and Warner and others in pushing a stopgap bill to restart those SBA loans immediately. If Congress passes the President's request, will the people needing loans at SBA in Roswell and other communities across the country be able to get the low-interest loans that they need to rebuild?
Yes, SBA is prepared to act swiftly to continue processing all the loans that are pending our review, as well as those that are already in queue, that nearly $1 billion. We will be able to immediately inform them within 24 to 48 hours, then get all the finalized closing documents to move quickly as possible.
Secretary Todman, HUD still has not approved the state of New Mexico's action plan for recovery from the floods and fire disasters of 2022. That is an impediment to recovery efforts. Do I have your commitment to approve New Mexico's plan before the end of the year when we'll see an administration change?
You know, my team did brief me on some of the technical difficulties the grantee has been experiencing, and we're going to provide technical assistance so we can try to get that across the line before the end of the year.
We need to get that. I mean, we will start from ground zero with a brand new administration with all the turnover. Like, we need to get that done by the end of the year.
You have my commitment.
Deputy Secretary Torres Small, the Santa Fe National Forest has been struggling for months to hire disaster recovery team members for Hermit's Peak, Calf Canyon, for the burn scar. And as you know, President Biden made a commitment to these communities. It's really critical that we get those hires done. Do you have an update on when those positions will be filled?
We've been working exceptionally hard, recognizing that we're doing so in a very challenging fiscal environment. As you know, it takes people to both fight fires but also manage a forest better in the future. We've been able to rebuild through the bipartisan infrastructure law, but now we're facing some real budget constraints. And so initially we had to impose a hiring pause, a hiring freeze all across the Forest Service as a result, because we're preparing for, as you mentioned, changes when it comes to appropriations dollars. That being said, there's an exceptions process, and recognizing the commitment that we have made in terms of recovery for Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire, we considered that exceptions process, and the Forest Service chief has reviewed 4 positions and approved 4 positions for hiring.
I think my time is expired. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Britt.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First, thank each and every one of you for being here today. Secretary Buttigieg, thank you for making time to come to Alabama and not only be there, but explore a little bit in Mobile. People really, really appreciated that and appreciate all of you being here and the work that you're doing. I do want to talk first to my colleagues. On January 12th, 2023, Selma, Alabama was hit and devastated by an EF2 tornado. And this piece of legislation has some some important funding for DRA, $10 million, to help with those communities that were affected by storms in 2023. Number one, I want to make sure that that money actually goes to these communities that were affected and need it, like Selma, to help them rebuild and create resiliency. But two, I want us to make sure we're looking at actual needs and that the needs are taken care of in this bill. I know for Selma, this is a start, but certainly will not meet that. And I think we all know that Selma and the community and the significant history that occurred there and the preservation of that is not just important for the state of Alabama. It's important for the nation, and it is important for the globe. And so I urge my colleagues to help me in this and make sure that the community of Selma has what it needs. And thank you to Senator Coons for the work he has done with me, alongside me on this. Deputy Secretary Torres Small, I want to associate myself with every comment made by my distinguished colleague from Mississippi, Senator Hyde-Smith. She is spot on, along with so many of my other colleagues on both sides of the aisle that have discussed agriculture issues. But I want to talk specifically about Alabama. Alabama agriculture producers are experiencing the same economic disasters as countless others are in the Southeast and across the nation. Year over year, inflation and debilitating domestic energy policies have led to soaring input cost, tanking commodity prices. You're looking at higher interest rates on capital needed to plant and cultivate farms and fields producing food for our nation's family. These variables, amongst others, are forcing Alabama farmers to make tough decisions about the future of their operations. It is hard to find a farmer in the entire state of Alabama who isn't hurting. According to the report released on September 5th of this year, overall net cash farm income in Alabama declined more than $1 billion between 2022 and 2023. This represents a staggering 33% loss in overall net cash farm income in just 1 year, much higher than the nation's decline of 19.5%. The main cause of this loss is out of the control of these farm families. They're doing everything that they're supposed to. They're taking a look at their input cost, and things just don't work. According to 2022 USDA Census of Agriculture, Alabama farmers experienced a 39.5% increase in cost of production from 2017 to 2022, ranking second amongst all southern states. So make no mistake, this is a crisis. And as Congress considers the disaster needs, we must also consider how to ensure that our agriculture producers receive quick and robust economic relief to ensure that our hardworking family farmers can enter the next planting season with certainty and allow our farm creditors to lend with confidence. So, Mrs. Torres Smalls, I want to make it clear that this is an immediate need for our farmers in Alabama and across the nation, and I look forward to working with you to provide this relief quickly so that our farmers can get seeds in the ground next spring. Thank you. I want to go ahead and move on to Administrator Criswell. I want to turn to the recent reports about FEMA. The supervisor, obviously, that we have all heard about, that you terminated. We continue to see more and more things come out. I actually sent you a letter regarding this incident, and while I received the response 4 days late, kudos to your team for getting it to me at 10:30 last night before today's hearing. Madam Chairman, I would like to ask you about a couple of the responses that I received in that letter. So in regards to my question about if you were going to discuss the fact that the investigations were underway, you immediately said that you had requested an investigation by DHS Office of Inspector General. In that, you said a couple of other things, and I just want to clarify that this investigation will not just be about one incident. You're going to allow this investigation to be across the footprint in all the states that FEMA operates.
Correct, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. And then additionally, and I heard you say it again today, you said you would take appropriate disciplinary and corrective actions if you found someone else to be complicit in this in that way. I want to make sure that that means that they will be terminated like Ms. Washington was.
Up to termination, depending on what the action was, yes.
But if the action was similar to hers, it will be termination.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time.
Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you all for being here and appreciate very much your service. West Virginia is West Virginia is the only state that lies completely within the Appalachian Mountain region. Despite this, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's definition of rural excludes some of the most geographically isolated and unpopulated areas of my state of West Virginia. Fayette County is one example. It's the largest city, has just under 8,000 residents, the largest city in the county. Its landscape is mountainous with secondary roads that make travel difficult. I know that Secretary Buttigieg has been there before. Over the last several years, it has been hit with devastating floods. However, many programs across the federal government classify the county as urban, preventing from accessing the resources they need. At my urging, the United States Department of Agriculture Economic Research Services recognized the unique topographic of our state in their recent report on rugged terrain. The report found that almost 81% of West Virginians live in a rugged area. That's compared to just 11.7% of the entire United States population. Well, that's why they call us Mount Mama. Several agencies have proposed ways to incorporate ruggedness into their definition of rural to ensure that critical resources are reaching those areas in most need. Many disaster programs that your agencies oversee direct specific resources to rural areas, but do not adequately recognize the Appalachian as rural. This means that West Virginians that are impacted by disasters are not really getting the help and the support that they need. So I don't know, I just would hope that all of you would be cognizant of this ruggedness definition, because it is unbelievable. You know, sometimes in our state, you only see the sun from 11 to 2. Anyway, they're beautiful people, but they just need the same assistance everyone else. This is to my friend, Secretary Buttigieg. The Appalachian Development Highway System was established in 1965 to connect I-81 in Virginia to I-79 in West Virginia. And over 55 years later, we're still working on it. We're getting better. In a state as rugged and, again, mountainous as mine, natural disasters can quickly cut West Virginians off from help. And this is a lifeline coming from east to west, west to east. Connecting this population base of D.C. metro area into the interior of West Virginia would be a game changer for our state, both logistically and economically, and allow us to better prepare for natural disaster. We only have about 15 miles left as far as when we're en route to get everything in West Virginia done. Our trouble is basically coming to Wardensville, West Virginia, going into connecting I-81. It starts right now. The Corridor H comes to Wardensville, and it stops. And we see no movement whatsoever to connect to I-81. We knew there was a lot of politics in before, but we think that has all been passed through. If you could look at that, sir, that would be the last major connection. It would truly, truly set us up in a much better situation. I don't know if you were made aware of that.
Thank you. Yes, we're very aware of the importance of the Corridor H vision to you and to the people of West Virginia. I do know that West Virginia intends to use their National Highway Freight Program formula funds for Corridor H, and that will amount to a portion of what I believe is $203 million of formula funding coming their way. I know that there have also been applications for discretionary programs, and we're aware of a set-aside that's contemplated in those programs. So we'll keep working with the West Virginia DOT on that.
If you can just check on the Virginia side, my dear friends in Virginia, who
Will
I
do.
love very much, and I want you to know, we did not break away from Virginia. They left us.
I'll make sure to ask him about that, Senator.
This is to Administrator Guzman. The Small Business Administration Disaster Loan Program is a vital lifeline for communities recovering from major disasters, such as Hurricanes Helen and Milton. These large-scale events require significant resources. My colleagues have rightfully acknowledged SBA's efforts in providing critical support. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize SBA's role in addressing smaller-scale disasters year-round. Earlier this year, my state of West Virginia was a great example when the SBA made economic injury disaster loans available to small businesses and agriculture co-ops impacted by severe drought conditions in West Virginia. Thank you, thank you, thank you. These types of losses often don't qualify for FEMA or CDBG funding, so I appreciate you taking the initiative, Secretary, working with us on those as well. So what I can ask is, could you speak to how SBA balances the needs of larger scale disasters with the smaller localized ones that are left behind?
Happy to do that, yes. I mean, in any given time, we have, of course, the presidential declarations, but our own set of SBA disasters that we work coordinating with the governors to ensure that we can support, as well as through USDA on any of those crop disruptions. And so, currently I have about 220 crop disruptions, as well as 11 SBA-only declarations. We deploy our teams for those physical as well as economic injury disaster loans. For those economic injury, we work through our partners on the ground to ensure that there's awareness. The disaster administration dollars that we get to make sure we can deploy as extensively as possible is very critical for us, and to ensuring people are aware of these resources that are available on the ground. And we will always continue to try to do a better job working in partnership with locals to ensure that there's awareness of these great resources.
Thank you so much. I just wrap up. The ruggedness situation is important to myself and Senator Capito. We're very concerned because we have a beautiful rugged state. Corridor H is important to connect us to the metropolitan areas, to finish that up, and helping the small businesses that don't qualify for FEMA net. They can't make it without a little bit of assistance. Thank you all. I appreciate your service. Thank you very much.
Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to those of you who are here today. Just listening to each of our colleagues from around the country talk about the various disasters that have impacted them, whether it is droughts or floods, landslides. Our reality is that what we are seeing is accelerating in terms of not only the types of disasters that we are seeing, but the economic impact, the security impact, and of course, the loss of life. I was out in Guam a few weeks ago with Senator Manchin. We're looking to Guam to be this platform for defense for the country, but they're digging out of a typhoon from 2 years, or Marwar, 2 years ago now, I believe it is. Secretary Buttigieg, I appreciate the fact that the Alaska $107 million in the emergency response account addresses Typhoon Merbok, but again, that's a disaster 2 years ago. I think we recognize that we are dealing now, okay, we're talking about Milton, we're talking about Helene, but we still have on the books all of these other disasters that we can name, that we can relate to. And so we've got a system that is not keeping up. It does not have the nimbleness. It doesn't have the reflexes that we need. When Senator Coons talks about resilience, and do we need a resilience strategy? I think we need more than that. When we are tasked with, well, okay, here's the funding, here's the response, but there's strings attached to it, and so instead of building back better, it's building back substantially similar. And if you're being threatened by coastal erosion, where the disaster next year is just going to be worse than what you had last year, it doesn't make anybody feel secure in their homes. Today is the 1-year anniversary of a landslide in one of my hometowns, Wrangell, Alaska, where 6 lives were lost, a family of 5, when a landslide came down in a part of the community that nobody anticipated, thought was going to break loose, but it was intense rains combined with winds. And our reality is our lack of preparedness, our lack of being able to monitor, our lack of censoring, our lack of truly understanding our ability to track our weather systems. In all of Southeast, an area that is the size of the state of Florida, I'm told that we have 1 radar. So it's no wonder that we're not able to anticipate what is coming at us and to better protect our communities. The hometown, the town that I was born in Ketchikan, experienced a deadly landslide just a few months ago. We are talking about small scale, big scale, but whatever it is that is hitting us, your agencies are struggling. Your agencies are overwhelmed, whether you are FEMA or whether it's any one of you. One of the agencies that's not represented at the table today is someone from Commerce. I wanted to ask about why we don't have anybody to talk about the fact that there is no assistance, no disaster assistance for the ongoing fisheries disasters that we are seeing in my part of the country, and Senator Shaheen's and Senator Murray's here, we're told, well, maybe there's going to be another supplemental. But in the meantime, our fishermen, our coastal communities that rely on them are being devastated, just literally taken out at the knees. There are no funds in the Fisheries Resource Disaster Assistance account. There are no funds. And so how we deal with these disasters is very real and very personal to each and every one of us. Let me ask a question, because I've talked more than I need to here, but we have people that are not going to wait for you all to come and help them. Kotzebue just experienced a major flooding. They need to get things secure before winter really hits, which it already is. Ice is coming. They're locked in. They've got to spend the money. They can't wait. They can't wait to have Department of Transportation. Again, Secretary, I appreciate that we've got $107 million in that account, the unmet needs account. But how do we cut through the tape to ensure that the aid is not delayed because of this back-end accounting requirement about which the costs are attributable to the agencies? This is a challenge for people. They need to move forward, but they're afraid they're not going to be able to get the reimbursement. Is there some way to embrace something like advanced construction concept for disaster response? I think these are the types of things that we need to be thinking about. My time is out, but if you have a quick answer, answer it. In the meantime, we've all got to be thinking about how we can address what I think is a disaster response system that is not meeting the current state of affairs.
Very briefly, you have my commitment to work within, to do everything as flexibly and swiftly as we can within the statute that we have, and for technical advice on anything that could help create some flexibilities, like you mentioned. Things like advanced work have helped on regular construction to not have to wait for all of the obligation machinery to move. Would welcome exploring ways to bring that to bear in Alaska. And having visited Kotzebue last year when I went to Alaska at your invitation, I have some sense of what they're up against. Our field staff on the ground in Alaska will be ready to assist any way they can.
And I would hope that the rest of you on the panel would also agree.
Senator, I would add that if our disaster recovery funds are approved, it will be available for your fisheries.
Yay! Best news of the day. Thank you.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to each of you for being here and for the hard work that so many members that everyone in your agencies are doing to help those people affected by these terrible emergencies. Deputy Secretary Torres, you had a chance to come to New Hampshire and to talk with some of our farmers. I was interested in Senator Ossoff talking about some of the farmers in Georgia who lost 20 to 30% of their crops. Well, we had fruit growers in New Hampshire, as you know, who lost 80 to 100% of their stone crops. Everything they lost in 2023 because of the freeze and late frost that really devastated so many of our growers. And because we have small farms and about 90% of our growers don't participate in federal crop insurance programs because the crop insurance programs have not really been designed to help farmers like we have in New Hampshire. Senator Collins talked about the same challenges in Maine. So how does the agency estimate accurate losses for states with high rates of small and diversified farms that have limited engagement with the federal programs?
This is an issue that's especially important in New Hampshire, and in my visit and conversations with fruit farmers in New Hampshire certainly saw that the insurance payments, insurance programs don't fully recognize the need, particularly when it comes to specialty crops. So our estimate of the 2023 losses of $10.7 million was based on the known and estimated insurance as well as NAP NAP indemnity payments. And so recognizing that that may not be the full and complete picture, we know that there was a cooperative extension estimate that was 26 million.
Right.
So in addition to continuing to work with your team, we also know that we need to expand those insurance programs. NAP is a fundamental way of doing that because it helps build the case for actual insurance programs in the future. We also just recently announced the CCC specialty crop program that'll be $2 billion to provide marketing support and assistance for specialty crops.
So does the estimate that's been sent to this committee for covering losses, farm losses, would it allow for a number that's greater than the 10.7 million that you've determined?
So the first amount is based on the indemnity payments and information that we have there. We also plan, if asked to administer an ERP, there's a second track for revenue losses, and certainly could consider that there.
Because clearly those numbers don't reflect the real losses that we're experiencing in a state like New Hampshire. Administrator Griswold, we have, I would like to add my concerns to what we've heard from a number of members here about the length of time that so many of our small communities are waiting. And I appreciate that there have been so many disasters that it's hard to keep up, but we have communities in New Hampshire going from the Canadian border in the north to the Massachusetts border in the south, every place from Pittsburgh to Ackworth, that have not yet received reimbursements, and they've been waiting for about 2 years. So what can we do to try and move those checks along? As everyone has said, these are small communities. They've been hit hard. They don't have the capacity to cover those kind of rebuilding costs, and they really need to be reimbursed once they've filled out their paperwork, and they need to see those dollars coming in.
Yes, Senator, we understand that these cash flow issues are critical for these small communities. And again, every community has their own specific needs, requirements, and paperwork that we have to have submitted. If you have somebody specific, I'm happy to look into individual cases to see if there's something that we can do to move it along. Part of our changes recently with increasing the dollar threshold on small projects helps to simplify that procedure. But we also have other mechanisms that we can put in place to do advance payments so they don't have to wait for the entire project to be done. If that's something that would benefit, I'd be happy to look into that for your particular communities. But we want to continue to work with you on how do we make this simpler as we continue to see more disasters happening across the United States.
And I think that's very important. These are communities that's my understanding have already submitted their paperwork, and they are in compliance. They're just waiting for their checks. It includes Dalton, Ackworth, Hampton, Gorham, Newton, Ossipee, Littleton, Pittsburgh, and Monroe. So it's across the state, and once they've submitted the paperwork, it seems to me that they ought to be able to get the reimbursements.
Yeah, if they've submitted all of the paperwork, they should have been reimbursed. So I'll look into those personally and see what we can find out.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And since I chair the Small Business Committee, I would just like to add for Administrator Guzman, thank you for all of the work that you're doing. Small businesses, as we know, are the heart of our economy throughout this country, particularly in New Hampshire. And we have, as you pointed out, more than 10,000 homeowners and small business owners with approved loans who are just waiting on our appropriation from this committee and this Congress to get to work rebuilding. So thank you.
Senator Schumer Capito.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank all of you for being here. I know it's been a long morning, but it's critically important. Just as a statement, I'll tell you, I hail from West Virginia. Senator Manchin does as well. I think all of us here I don't want to speak for everybody, but certainly for me, I know if the disaster is not occurring in West Virginia, it's occurring somewhere else, it's going to occur in West Virginia. So I've always been very supportive of making sure that all of our communities across the country are able to get the disaster relief and as quickly as possible. So put me in that category of somebody who knows if not for me, it will be me and it will be us. Administrator Criswell, I would like to thank you for in your opening statement. You mentioned that nobody should be discriminated against for their political affiliations or anything else. And so thank you for reinforcing that policy. It's important. I would say if that particular FEMA employee had come to West Virginia, we wouldn't have gotten much help because we had a lot of Trump signs all throughout our state. So thank you for that. I was going to kind of call you into question on some of the environmental review processes that have been going on. We had a town in West Virginia that has been going over 2 years trying to get this environmental review for something as simple as a generator, a static security camera, or basic pre-disaster mitigation equipment, just the bureaucracies of this. But I was just informed that they got there okay today. So thank you for that. You can take credit for that. On to drought. Let me stay with you for a moment because I was the ranking member and the chair at some point of the Homeland Security Subcommittee on Appropriations. This is a perennial problem in terms, but how many, can we help you and help FEMA as an organization take some of these older disasters off of the books, maybe figure out a process where we work with our states and our localities. Obviously, there's going to be a funding issue there where that causes you so you don't have these backlogs and lags of disasters that are still ongoing while you're trying to face what you see in front of you. What kind of measures do you think would help you do that, and would that be useful?
Senator, I think, we've seen a number of disasters that have been ongoing for many years. I mean, we still have some back to Hurricane Katrina. One of the things that we have started doing is a program that we're calling Validate As You Go. Part of the delay in closing out some of these projects sometimes is after they go through years of gathering the paperwork, doing the rebuild, we do all of the closeout at the very end of the project, and that can be time consuming to go look at every receipt and every action that was taken along the way. We've started to do that periodically and auditing it along the way, so that way it speeds up the process at the end. And we're starting to see real success with implementing this new way of approaching disaster closeout, which we've just started doing over the last few years.
So you're closing out portions of the disaster as you're moving it along.
We are auditing it as we go along, and if we find that they are meeting everything, then we don't have to review every single submission, every receipt at the closeout phase of a project.
Well, it seems to me you could enlist your state and local partners too to be able to help you with some of that work rather than diverting your workforce who has the immediate needs in these larger disasters. But we want to work to make that process easier so you can close the books and you can move forward. So anything we can do to help in that would be appreciated. I'm going to talk about the drought just briefly because West Virginia really has been. We don't have a huge ag community, but but just some of the statistics are quite startling. 90% of our soybean crop condition is in poor or very poor condition. 100% of our hay crop is in poor and very poor categories, and 97% of our soybean crop is in well, I already said that 97% of our soybean is in poor or near poor conditions. So you all at Ag have been helping us as an office to reach out to our Ag community. So I appreciate that. The last question I have is, apparently NOAA has an artificial intelligence mapping system where they map on the coastlines what could be tracking impervious surfaces of roadway water runoff and how inundation modeling can help save lives. But a lot of the country's been left out of this AI modeling. I understand the coastal issues, but describing, as Senator Manchin did, our terrain, we're very prone to flooding. So I don't know, Secretary Buttigieg, are you using similar technology for mapping pre-disaster and water runoff so that you can more accurately see where your vulnerabilities are?
I'm not familiar with that particular program, but we do have a number of partnerships with sister agencies to try to get an understanding of any weather or climate issues that we need to handle. I would segregate that into two very separate types of operations, things like FAA that need immediate real-time information versus what we're doing for the longer term with infrastructure development or response. But happy to follow up and see.
Well,
if
this
we
is a
have anything on
NOAA
there.
program. I don't know if I mentioned that when I began the descriptions of it. And what about Administrator Criswell? Are you all familiar with that AI model that's being used to map?
Yeah, there's a number of models out there. NASA has one. There's several private sector agencies that also have different models. All of these are really important because as we consider the impacts that these communities are facing, what we want to be able to do is help them understand what their future risk is going
Right.
to be, because we obviously can see that we can't base it on historical risk. And so all of these different types of technologies, and we're trying to incorporate some of our own, but I think as we bring all of this together from the private sector, from NASA, from NOAA, all of those different technologies are going to really help us communicate and help communities understand and know their risks so they can make the appropriate preparatory actions and plans to help protect their citizens.
Well, I appreciate that, and I will say that we just signed a letter into requesting a disaster declaration for West Virginia from Helene. It didn't get the news, and it didn't, but that storm and that water really affected all of Appalachia, even into the areas of West Virginia. So I appreciate your attention on that. Thank you all very much.
Senator Van Hollen.
And I want to take this opportunity to thank President Biden and his entire team assembled here at the table. A special thanks to Secretary Buttigieg for all your help immediately on the scene after that disaster. Administrator Guzman, thank you, and the SBA for providing loans to businesses that were impacted. We lost 6 good people that day on the bridge. And I think everybody remembers the scenes of the Dolly, the ship, crashing into the Key Bridge and its collapse. And of course, it collapsed right into the Patapsco River, which is the channel to the Port of Baltimore. So I do want to start by thanking the Unified Command, Secretary Buttigieg, the Army Corps of Engineers, and everybody from the federal level who immediately helped starting to clear that channel, to reopen the port so that thousands of workers could get back to work and small businesses that had been terribly impacted by the closure of the port would have the relief they needed. And we were able to get that port channel reopened in a very short period of time, relatively speaking. So I want to thank everybody for their role in that. And Secretary Buttigieg, thank you also for mentioning the Key Bridge replacement, right? So we've got the port open. Now we've got to replace the Key Bridge. And I'm really pleased that the President's proposal, $100 billion, includes 100% funding for the Key Bridge. Yes, I heard Senator Collins mention that any insurance or other proceeds that come to the state of Maryland will be deducted from that. Yes, we get that. We understand that. We support that. But it is very important that we get this bridge rebuilt. 35,000 vehicles cross this bridge every day. So you can imagine the congestion and loss of economic opportunity that has been caused and ongoing because this bridge is no longer there. I will say, and I heard Senator Capito talk about how West Virginia had often been hit by natural disasters. Maryland has too, of course, and we've always supported the rest of the country. This has been all for one and one for all. That's been the motto of the state of Maryland. And so we're very much hoping, and we expect our colleagues from around the country to support us in this hour of need. I would point out that when the Minneapolis Bridge collapsed back in 2007, it took only 5 days for the Congress to pass and for the President to sign legislation assuring that they would be reimbursed 100% in terms of the cost of replacing the bridge. The House, the Senate, the President within 5 days. We are very grateful that we are already enrolled in the emergency relief program. That covers 90%. But, Mr. Secretary, I have 2 questions for you. One is, I know the proposal submitted by the President was not in legislative bill form, but in order for Maryland to secure the 100% change, we're going to need an authorization to do that. And just want to hear from you again that the President supports that. And if you could just talk about how important it is for the entire country to increase the funding for the emergency relief program.
Well, thank you. And yes, to be clear, the President, the administration completely support the 100% cost share, which would require legislation in addition to the funding that is part of the funding that we're asking for today. The total event cost we estimate to be $1.75 billion. The first $60 million went against that in the quick release funding that we turned around right away. That leaves $1.69 billion, less the $350 million that we already know is being recovered from insurance. That leaves 1.34, which is what is included in the supplemental. More broadly, I think that while unique, catastrophic, and we hope something of that type is never to be repeated again, it is a reminder that a single disaster can have a greater than $1 billion price tag. Right now, we have $119.6 million in the entire account, which means we are very much one disaster away from being completely out of funding. And it's why this funding request covers the entire backlog from Helene and Milton to the Francis Scott Key Bridge replacement to dozens of other disasters that we are still paying for in dozens of other states.
Thank you, and I want to thank my colleague and partner, Senator Cardin, and our entire Maryland delegation on a bipartisan basis, Senate and House, has introduced the Bridge Act to ensure that full 100% ultimately, and I thank you and, of course, the President for your support. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I get into my questions for the witnesses, I want to highlight the importance of funding the RIP and Replace program to protect broadband and telecommunication networks that are being damaged by storms and flooding and other disasters. Right now, broadband companies that are waiting on these dollars must rely on Chinese equipment that poses a threat to our national security, and their hands are tied from procuring new equipment when the network goes down due to damage as a result of storms or disasters. And that's why I believe funding the RIP and Replace shortfall, a bipartisan priority affecting rural broadband in states all across the country, should be a priority as part of this disaster relief package. My first question, though, is for Administrator Criswell. Ma'am, good to see you, Administrator. We work together a lot through my work on Homeland Security. And this year, FEMA announced the second round of awards for the Safeguarding Tomorrow's Revolving Loan Fund, which I created through a law entitled Safeguarding Tomorrow Through Ongoing Risk Mitigation Act, the STORM Act, aptly named. And it allows FEMA to help states and tribal governments set up low-cost revolving loans that funds local governments can get to mitigate their risk. So my question for you, Administrator, is can you discuss why having this tool in our resilience funding toolbox is so important, particularly in light of the disasters that we are seeing across our country now and the increasing frequency?
Yes, Senator Peters, I really appreciate your leadership in this bill and helping to get this across the finish line, because resilience and building resilience in our communities has never been more important. But what we see is some communities can't come up with the cost share for FEMA mitigation programs or other programs, or if they're using their own funding to seed a project. The STORM Act gives them a revolving loan fund to help start that project or meet a cost share from a mitigation project so they can get this critical work done. These mitigation projects are not inexpensive, and so being able to give them additional resources to help them envision and get these projects off the ground are going to help them in their ability to become stronger and withstand and reduce the impacts from future storms.
Great. Well, thank you. This next question is for all of our witnesses. One of the most persistent complaints about our disaster relief system that I hear is its complexity and its fragmentation. And it makes it very difficult for disaster survivors to navigate and receive the aid that they so desperately need. They are faced when they're the survivor of a tragedy with a house needing housing and food and all sorts of assistance, and yet they need to fill out multiple applications. Every agency has their own application, and you're telling someone who's in a pretty desperate shape, here are the 6 different applications you need to fill out to deal with the 6 different agencies. So I have authored a bill that's gotten through the Senate, the Simplification Act, that says that if you are a victim of this type of disaster, you should just fill out one form. This is pretty common sense. Fill out one form and immediately have all of the folks who can be helpful to you understand the extent of the problem for you, the help that you need, and to be able to deliver that. So basically, it would create a universal disaster application, and I think it's in the best interest of disaster survivors. I will tell you, when I talk about this, how this is popular with the folks, when I talk about this in a public meeting, I usually get applause. A lot of stuff I introduce, I do not get applause for, but this is just common sense, and we need to pass this, and I would like to have each of you tell me if you believe that creating a universal disaster application is indeed in the best interest of the survivors and will facilitate them getting the help that they need. And I know each of you are very anxious to provide, but how do we do it in a more efficient way? We'll start with you, Administrator, and work down the dais.
Thank you, Senator. I think anything we can do to remove the barriers that people are facing to receive assistance helps them on their road to recovery. And so it also gives them the opportunity to apply for the recovery. We find that if they have barriers like applying multiple times, then they will just stop. They will just give up. And so this type of an effort really helps ease that burden and helps them get into all of the programs that they're eligible for.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Senator, if HUD's disaster recovery program is finally authorized, then yes, we will be able to work very closely with our colleagues to make sure it's a seamless experience.
Great. With a universal application. Great.
Senator, thank you for talking about flexibilities. It is one of the most important things about disaster response. And I know that USDA has submitted multiple suggestions for how we can increase flexibilities with the authorities we have now. I also appreciate your effort to create more authorities for us to expand those authorities and make it so that on the hardest day of someone's life, they're not having to navigate multiple forms. We'd like to work with you as we address also the back end of that, which is all the computer systems that currently work with our existing applications, because that becomes a whole other side of implementation.
Great.
Senator, the SBA completely supports this concept of no wrong door. I will say that the great news is that earlier this year in March, FEMA and SBA cooperated together, and FEMA took leadership in passing an individual assistance change, which was transformative, which does get applauses, and that is no longer will you be required to fill out SBA's application to get assistance from FEMA. That was traumatic for people who were forced to come to us first, get denied, and then go to FEMA, which caused most of the friction you're referencing. So we're pleased that that no longer is the case. SBA, of course, is in a unique situation in that I support over 231 declarations in addition to the 21 presidential that I coordinate with these agencies with. And so while I support no wrong door, I do not support a control where one agency controls that universal platform. I would prefer a platform that would exist, that there is a back-end solutions across our agencies to ensure a seamless experience for that disaster survivor. And so we're working closely with FEMA right now to try to simplify the data sharing so that we can achieve that. And we'd be happy to provide technical assistance to make sure that that language in the bill doesn't force us to work through one agency on a universal application where we would have no control to make minor changes and have quick flexibility to best meet the needs of our businesses in particular, but of course all the homeowners that we support as well. So we're happy to work with you on this to try to see that through.
Good. Look forward to it. Mr. Secretary.
We are passionate about reducing the number of pages and the number of steps in any of our processes. That's why we've done things like the combined notices of funding opportunity in some of our grant programs. So without knowing all the details of this proposal, we would certainly welcome a chance to work on anything that would help simplify the process at the front end.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Merkley, last but not least, thank you for your patience.
And thank you to the patience of our witnesses. And my question is really to you, Deputy Secretary Torres Small. The estimates that we've received for the damage to infrastructure in the Forest Service is about $6.9 billion, and an additional $3.1 billion for the national parks, the Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM. Is that estimate about in the ballpark of what you've been hearing?
The current submission that we provided to OMB is $5.6 billion for Forest Service, so ballpark, but we should circle back on those numbers.
I think 5.6 was just Hurricane Helene. There is an additional amount in those numbers, about 1.3 for other damage.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. So my estimates are about right.
Correct.
So of that roughly $10 billion, and by the way, that what you just referred to, that was just the Forest Service, but then we have the damage to the infrastructure in these other areas, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, BLM. Thus, we end up with about $10 billion of damage. How many billion dollars are in this bill to address all that infrastructure damage on public lands?
So the current request does not include that damage. It acknowledges that there is this outstanding amount and commits to continuing to assess and provide
So the current
an
request
update.
is zero? Okay, 0 out of 10 billion. That's really the point I wanted to drive home. I really think it's completely unacceptable. And possibly you might say to me, or others might say to me, well, there is this mirage on the horizon of a second supplemental. Does anyone really think that that's going to happen? If we have the political will to address these issues, it's going to be addressed in this supplemental. And so I'm encouraging every possible effort. In 2020, Oregon had really horrific damage from catastrophic wildfires. My colleague was describing what happened to Hawaii, if Senator Schatz was, and Senator Padilla could tell you what happened in Paradise, California, and other fires in California. In 2020, we had 6 towns burned to the ground, another 6 deeply damaged. I traveled 600 miles north to south, south to north, never got out of the smoke. The ruins were something like out of a war zone. And the FY22 supplemental helped us. It helps us with the roads and bridges. It helps us remove hazardous fuels. It helped revegetate burned areas. It helped restore water systems. It set the foundation for restoring communities. So thank you to all my colleagues who supported those funds in FY22. But today, the request we have before us ignores the infrastructure on our public lands. And these disasters, hurricanes and wildfires and flash floods and landslides, they do enormous damage, and we need to restore that damage. Hurricane Helene destroyed or damaged 900 miles of roads and bridges in North Carolina's national forests, which the community depends on for day-to-day transportation, emergencies, evacuations. It caused dozens of landslides or rock slides on the Blue Ridge Parkway, gravely damaging the park. It wiped out or damaged more than 40 trestle bridges on the Rails to Trails Virginia Creeper Trail, a major economic driver in the southwest part of the state. Dozens of other national parks, wildlife refuges, national forests suffered damages from the disasters over the last 2 years. Damage in Yosemite and Sequoia and Kings Canyon, Acadia, Death Valley, Okefenokee Wildlife Refuge. We have a long history of caring for our public lands. It's carried in the heart of every American, but this bill fails to honor that responsibility. Now, I was thinking back how in FY22 supplemental, we immediately addressed the almost $1 billion of damage in Yellowstone. People will remember the videos of houses falling into the river and floating down and kind of key access, and we did the right thing. We helped address the road system, the water system. That's what we need to be doing now on this. If folks don't have a picture of what I'm talking about buildings, roads, trestles, bridges, the communication systems, the water systems, the recreation sites, the research sites, and the trails. We must not say that it's okay to have that devastation sit there unaddressed. Thank you.
Thank you. That will conclude our hearing for today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us for this really critical discussion. As is clear, people are hurting, and it is crucial that we get them the help they need by passing a bipartisan disaster supplemental. I will continue to work with Vice Chair Collins and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to get that done and to wrap up our FY25 spending bills in a bipartisan way, consistent with our Senate bills. So for any senators who wish to ask additional questions for the record will be due in 7 days, Wednesday, November 27th by 5 p.m. That committee stands adjourned.